Hey, come on in. Pull that blanket up around your shoulders and dim the lamp near you if you have one nearby. I'm glad you found your way here tonight, whoever you are and wherever this video happens to catch you, because tonight we are going somewhere that does not exist anymore, a place with no name on any modern map, and somehow it managed to leave a small piece of itself behind waiting for us for 99 million years. Picture a stone, small enough to rest inside the palm of your hand, warm and golden, almost like a drop of frozen honey. Inside it, if you look closely enough under the light, there is a tail. Soft feathers the colour of chestnut and cream. Tiny bones, each one no bigger than a single grain of rice. It did not come from a bird. It lived before birds had fully become what we now call birds. And for nearly 100 million years, not one single person on this earth knew that it was there. Before we step into that vanished forest together, let's make a small agreement just between the two of us. If stories like this one make your evening feel a little softer, a little more amazed at how strange and beautiful this world can be, go ahead and tap that subscribe button, drop a quick like, and maybe leave me a comment down below. I go through every single one. Tell me where you're watching from tonight and what time it is there wherever there happens to be. I love imagining all of you scattered across so many different clocks and countries, somehow meeting me here in the very same story. Now go ahead and turn the lights down as low as feels comfortable. Maybe switch on a fan or some gentle rain sound in the background, whatever helps. This feels less like a video and more like a memory you're slowly stepping into. Get settled. Tonight we're going back further than almost anywhere I have ever taken you. Somewhere in what is now the northern reaches of Myanmar in a river valley called Hukang, there was once a forest that no human eye would ever see while it still stood. This was the middle of the age we call the Cretaceous, around 99 million years before your alarm clock went off this morning. Not a single flower on this planet had learned to smell sweet yet. Not one bee existed to visit one, and the animals we usually picture when we hear the word dinosaur, the giants, the roaring ones, were only distant cousins to the creature this story is actually about. The morning here began the way most mornings in this forest began, slow, damp and loud in a way that silence never quite is. Mist clung low between the trunks of tall conifers, distant cousins of the resin-rich trees that still grow today in the rainforest south of the equator. Ferns the size of small cars unrolled new fronds toward whatever thin light made it through the canopy. Somewhere far above, leathery wings cut across the grey sky, a flying reptile riding the warm air on its morning hunt, gone again before you could really study it. Down on the forest floor the air sat thick and heavy, the kind of warmth that clings to your skin like a damp towel you forgot to hang up. A shallow river moved lazily through the valley, brown with sediment lined with plants that had no name yet because there was no one around to give them one. And moving low through the undergrowth near the water's edge was something small, something you might almost mistake at first glance for a bird. Picture, if you can, a creature no larger than a sparrow having a rather bad day. Chestnut brown across its back, pale and cream-coloured underneath, with a long slender tail trailing behind it, covered in soft fluffy plumage more like down than the sleek flight feathers we picture on birds today. This was not a bird. Not yet. It belonged to a strange in-between branch of the family tree, the kind of creature that reminds you evolution rarely moves in neat, tidy lines. It had feathers, yes, but it could not fly. Its tail was long and boned nothing like the short, stubby tail birds carry now. It was in almost every sense caught between two versions of itself. It spent the morning the way most small creatures spend their mornings, which is to say mostly worrying about breakfast. It picked through wet leaf litter near the riverbank, snapping up beetles, flicking its tail for balance, the way a cat might flick its own, a habit it likely never once thought about, the same way you never think about your own hands moving while you talk. Once it froze completely still for almost a full minute, when something considerably larger moved through the ferns nearby, a shape too big to be curious about and far too big to challenge. Its heart, if we could somehow have measured it, was likely hammering away at a speed no human heart has ever reached. Small animals tend to run hot and fast, like that built more like hummingbirds than the lumbering giants we usually picture when this era comes up in conversation. Then just as quickly the danger passed and it relaxed and went right back to hunting, because that is mostly what survival in a place like this actually looks like. Not constant terror, just quiet, careful attention over and over all day long, punctuated every so often by a jolt of fear that never quite finishes what it started. By midday, dark clouds rolled in off the mountains to the west, and the forest did what tropical forests still do today. It opened up completely. Warm rain fell in heavy straight sheets for the better part of an hour, drumming on broad leaves, flooding narrow paths between the roots, sending our small feathered friend scrambling for shelter beneath an overhanging fern the size of a garden umbrella. It waited the storm out there, feathers slightly damp tail curled tight against its own body, patient in the particular way that small hunted animals learn to be patient. When the rain finally passed, the whole forest seemed to exhale. Steam rose gently off warm bark. Insects that had gone quiet during the storm slowly started their chorus again, one clicking voice at a time, until the whole valley hummed once more. And by late afternoon, our small dinosaur had wandered further from the river than it usually liked to go, chasing a trail of ants that marched in a slow, determined column across the forest floor, each one carrying a piece of leaf twice its own size, with absolutely no idea that they too are about to become part of a story that would outlive every civilization that would ever exist. The ants led it straight toward the base of one particular tree. The light was beginning to change now. Late afternoon, the kind that turns a forest gold for a few short minutes before the shadows take over completely. And it was in this exact kind of light that the tree beside our small feathered friend had begun quietly to bleed. Not blood, of course, resin. The storm that morning had likely cracked something deep in the bark, or maybe it was simply the tree's own rapid growth putting pressure on old wood nobody left behind to say for certain which. Either way, a slow, thick ribbon of sap had started sliding down the trunk, catching the last of the afternoon sun, until it looked almost molten, almost alive, and carrying with it a scent not unlike fresh pine needles, warm and sharp and strangely sweet all at once. Trees do this constantly, even now in your own backyard. If a pine tree happens to grow near enough, it is simply how they heal. A small crack in the bark, a beetle's bite, even just the pressure of growing too fast. And out comes this slow, golden stream, sealing the injury before it can spread. The little dinosaur, if you can even call something so small and so feathered by that word without picturing something enormous and terrifying, had no reason to notice the resin at all. Trees drip sap constantly in a forest like this one. It was background noise, the same way you stop noticing the hum of your own refrigerator after living with it long enough. It was far too busy following ants toward what it hoped might be a proper meal before the light disappeared completely. It moved closer to the base of the trunk, and its tail trailing loosely behind it as always brushed straight through the slow-moving resin. Now, resin like this does not grab you the way a hand would. It is not fast. It is not violent. It simply holds, thick and patient, wrapping itself gently around anything it touches the way honey clings to a spoon you tried to set down too quickly. For one heartbeat, nothing seemed wrong at all. Then came the pull, a small strange resistance where there should have been none. We do not know, and I want to be honest with you here because I think honesty matters more than a tidy ending. We do not know exactly what happened in the next few seconds. whether our small feathered friend twisted free and ran on into the gathering dark, leaving only the very tip of its tail behind, or whether that quiet golden afternoon beside the Hukang River was the last afternoon it would ever see. Paleontologists have studied this exact piece of amber for years, turning it under microscopes, scanning it with machines that can see straight through solid stone, and even they will tell you plainly that some questions simply do not have an answer waiting on the other side. The forest kept that secret. It kept it through the setting of that sun and every sun that rose and set after it. It kept it as the resin slowly thickened, then hardened, then buried itself under layer after layer of falling leaves, dust and time. It kept it as the shallow river beside that forest changed course, flooded, dried, and vanished completely along with every plant and insect that had ever lived beside it. It kept it as new. Forest grew and died above the old one again and again for longer than the human imagination is really built to hold. Continents that once sat near one another drifted slowly apart during all of this the same way they still do today, just far too slowly for us to feel it happening under our own feet. Somewhere around 33 million years after this particular afternoon, a piece of rock from outer space would strike the Earth on the other side of the planet, ending the age of the giant dinosaurs almost entirely. Though our small feathered relative safely sealed in golden stone would never know that the world above it had changed forever. Not far from this very valley, one whole landmass would eventually go crashing slowly and patiently into another, folding the ground upward until it formed the tallest mountain range on the planet, the range we now call the Himalayas, near enough that their shadow would one day fall across this same buried stone. Ice spread across the earth and pulled back again more than once, the most recent retreat happening a mere 11,000 years ago, practically yesterday by comparison to everything else in this story. Entire species of animals we'll never get to meet rose, thrived, and disappeared completely without a single photograph, a single bone, a single trace, while this one small drop of golden resin sat sealed and untouched, pressed under stone and mineral and the sheer patient weight of time itself. 99 million years is not a number your mind is built to picture, and honestly, neither is mine. So do not worry if it slips through your fingers a little. What matters is this: through every single one of those years, through ice ages and shifting seas and empires that would rise, rule, and crumble to dust on the surface far above it, that one small piece of amber sat waiting underground. Not lost, not exactly, just patient. Because one day in a country that would not exist for another 99 million years, wearing a name no dinosaur could ever have imagined, someone would finally dig it up, turn it over in the sunlight and notice something small and feathered curled up inside, and finally ask the question this whole story has been quietly waiting for someone to ask. How does a drop of tree sap survive that long? How does something this soft, this fragile, this completely at the mercy of time end up harder than the stone around it, carrying a piece of a vanished world safely across 99 million years right into someone's open hand? That is exactly where we are headed next, into the strange, slow chemistry that turns ordinary tree sap into something closer to eternity. Hi again, or hello if this happens to be the very first moment you're joining me. Either way, come on in, get yourself settled, maybe pull that blanket a little higher this time. We left off in a rather strange place last time, halfway through, a question that does not really have a simple answer, and I have been looking forward all day to finally sitting down and telling you the rest of it. Somewhere on your kitchen counter right now there is probably a bottle of honey or maple syrup sitting quietly in a cupboard. Give it 100 years, give it 1,000, it will still just be syrup slowly turning cloudy, maybe a little strange, but nothing more than that. So why did one particular drop of tree sap out of every single drop that has ever fallen in the entire history of this planet manage to survive long enough to outlast the dinosaurs, the ice ages, and every human civilization that came after them? The honest answer involves almost no magic at all, and somehow that turns out to be the most remarkable part of the whole story. Before we get into the actual chemistry of it, which I promise is far more beautiful than that word usually sounds, let's do our little ritual together. If you are the sort of person who enjoys falling asleep to a story that also happens to be true, go ahead and tap that subscribe button, drop a like. And if you have a spare second, leave me a comment down below. Tell me something small like what your evening looks like right now, or which corner of the world you are curled up in while listening to someone explain tree sap to you at this hour. I look over those comments more often than you would probably guess, and they make this feel a lot less like talking into an empty room. Alright, lights down low again if you can manage it. Maybe that same soft fan or gentle rain sound humming somewhere behind you, and let's keep going. Here is the honest, slightly deflating truth. Almost none of it survives. Trees produce resin constantly all over the world every single day, and have done so for hundreds of millions of years. Walk through practically any pine forest today, and you will find sap on the bark, sticky and fresh, glinting a little in the light. Give that same sap a few weeks and most of it dries out cracks, gets nibbled on by insects, or simply washes away in the next heavy rain. Give it a few decades and whatever managed to hang on will likely have rotted, crumbled, or been swallowed whole by soil and time. Becoming true amber is not really the normal outcome for tree sap at all. It is closer to winning a very slow, very strange lottery one where the odds are stacked against you at almost every single step along the way. So what actually makes resin different from an ordinary tree secretion in the first place? At its core, resin is a thick, sticky cocktail of small molecules the tree produces mainly as a kind of natural first aid. When bark splits, when a beetle bites through, when infection threatens to spread through the trunk, the tree responds the same way your own skin responds to a scrape, by sealing the damage as fast as it possibly can. These molecules, scientists group them under the term terpenoids, are built from small repeating chemical units, a little like microscopic building blocks stacked together in slightly different patterns, depending on the species of tree. Fresh resin is only the very first stage of a much longer journey. Over the following weeks and months, the lighter, more fragrant compounds inside it slowly evaporate into the air, which is part of why a pine forest smells the way it does on a warm afternoon. What remains behind grows firmer, thicker, more stable. If conditions are right and it manages to avoid being eaten, dissolved or scattered, this hardened resin can eventually become what collectors and scientists both call copal. Copal sits in an odd in-between category, and honestly this is where a great deal of confusion happens even among people selling amber jewellery, who probably should know better. Copal can be as young as a few hundred years old, or as old as a few 100,000, and it often looks remarkably similar to true amber to an untrained eye. It still smells faintly of pine if you heat it gently. It can still dissolve at least partially in certain solvents. In a very real chemical sense, copal has not quite finished becoming what it is eventually going to become. It is amber's much younger, much less patient cousin. This confusion is not just a historical curiosity either. Walk into pretty much any souvenir market near an amber-producing region today, and you will likely find vendors selling copal, or sometimes even ordinary plastic confidently labelled as ancient amber, occasionally for a rather serious amount of money. Collectors and gemologists have worked out a handful of surprisingly simple tests over the years to sort out the truth. Real amber rubbed briskly between your fingers until it warms up releases a faint, unmistakable scent of pine, the very same scent that started this whole chemical journey millions of years earlier. Plastic rubbed the exact same way tends to smell sharp and chemical. Instead, nothing like a forest at all. Drop a piece into a glass of heavily salted water, and true amber along with copal will typically float just below the surface, while most plastic imitations sink straight to the bottom, being noticeably denser. Telling amber apart from copal specifically takes a slightly steadier hand, often involving a single drop of solvent, applied carefully to some unnoticeable edge, since copal not yet fully polymerized tends to grow soft and tacky, where true amber remains completely unaffected. There is something fitting about that, honestly. Even now, the surest way to separate real deep time from a convincing imitation still comes down to simple chemistry. True amber requires something copal has simply not had enough time to achieve, a process chemists call polymerization. Picture millions of those small building block molecules I mentioned earlier, each one originally separate floating loosely among its neighbors. Over the passage of enormous stretches of time under just the right pressure, sealed away from open air, these molecules slowly begin linking arms with the molecules beside them, one connection at a time, then another, until eventually the entire mass stops behaving like a collection of separate pieces entirely, and instead behaves like one single continuous structure, hard, stable, chemically almost as inert as glass. And here is the detail I find most quietly remarkable about the whole process. Time alone is not actually the main ingredient. Burial is, specifically burial away from oxygen and away from the countless hungry microorganisms that spend their entire existence breaking organic material back down into soil. Oxygen and bacteria are the real villains in almost every story about decay on this planet, or as far as we currently know on any other. Seal something away from both quickly and completely enough, and you have removed the two forces most responsible for erasing the past. This is also precisely why amber preserves things so differently from an ordinary fossil. Most fossils you've likely seen in a museum, a dinosaur skeleton for instance, were not preserved the way you might assume. Water rich in minerals slowly seep through buried bone over enormous spans of time, replacing the original organic material cell by cell with solid stone, until essentially nothing of the original animal remains at all beyond its exact shape, recreated in rock. It is less like preservation, and more like an extraordinarily patient, extraordinarily accurate sculpture. Amber does something almost the opposite. Rather than slowly replacing the original material, it seals it away nearly untouched, holding on to texture, structure, and in rare cases even original color at a level of detail stone can never quite manage to capture. Not every amber on Earth tells the exact same story either, and this part surprised me more than I expected the first time I looked into it properly. Along the shores of the Baltic Sea in northern Europe lies one of the largest amber deposits on the planet, formed around 44 million years ago in dense humid forests that no longer exist in that form anywhere on Earth. Scientists still debate, sometimes rather passionately, exactly which ancient conifer produced it. What they do agree on is its distinctive chemical signature, a compound called succinic acid, found in high enough amounts that Baltic amber even carries its own separate scientific name, succinite. People living along that coastline have been collecting it, trading it and wearing it for roughly 13,000 years, long before anyone alive understood a single thing about polymer chemistry. Far across the ocean in the Caribbean sits a very different kind of amber entirely. Dominican amber, mined largely on the island of Hispaniola, came from a completely different family of tree altogether, Not a needle-bearing conifer at all, but a flowering leguminous tree distantly related to the carob trees still grown in warmer regions today. Because of that different chemistry, Dominican amber often turns out remarkably clear, almost glass-like, which is part of why it has produced some of the most strikingly well-preserved insects ever found anywhere, and honestly part of why a rather famous movie about cloning dinosaurs chose it as its centerpiece. Which brings us to a myth I think is worth clearing up gently right here before we go any further. That movie and the book behind it imagined scientists pulling dinosaur blood from a mosquito trapped in amber and using it to bring the animals themselves back to life. It is a wonderful piece of storytelling. It is also, according to essentially every scientist who has seriously studied the question, not something that could actually happen. In the 1990s, researchers did report extracting fragments of ancient-looking deoxyribonucleic acid from insects preserved in amber, and the announcement made headlines across the world. But as testing methods improved over the following years, other laboratories tried repeatedly to reproduce those exact results, and simply could not. The working explanation now is contamination, modern deoxyribonucleic acid, from skin, from dust, from the researchers themselves sneaking into incredibly sensitive samples. Deoxyribonucleic acid, it turns out, is a remarkably fragile molecule. Even under the most ideal conditions scientists have ever measured deep inside ancient ice. For example, it appears to break down completely, somewhere around 1 million years give or take, which sounds like an enormous stretch of time right up until you set it beside a piece of amber that is 99 million years old. So no, there will not be a real dinosaur wandering around your backyard anytime soon. And if we are being completely honest with each other, your fence probably could not have handled that responsibility regardless. Here is the part I actually find more moving than genetic code ever could be, though. Amber may not preserve deoxyribonucleic acid, but it preserves something arguably far more intimate. Not a blueprint waiting to be rebuilt from scratch in some laboratory, but the actual thing itself captured mid-moment exactly as it was, exact posture, exact texture. In the case of that small feathered tail, we spent our last story with even the original colour pigments still faintly visible beneath a microscope 99 million years later. A blueprint only tells you what something could theoretically become given enough guesswork and imagination. Amber shows you without a single guess, required what something actually undeniably was on one particular afternoon in one particular forest that otherwise vanished completely from the surface of the earth, along with almost everything that ever lived in it, which brings us back to that single golden drop resting quietly in the Hukong Valley, buried quickly, sealed away from air, left undisturbed by the countless small disasters that destroy almost everything else that has ever fallen, dripped, or drifted to a forest floor. Given against every reasonable statistical odd, exactly the right conditions across tens of millions of years to complete that slow chemical journey from ordinary sap into something closer to stone, and somehow at the very same time closer to memory. Long before any scientist understood a single word of that chemistry, though ordinary people were already pulling pieces of amber, like this one out of riverbanks and shorelines, all across the world, turning them over in their palms, utterly amazed by how warm and alive they felt for something so clearly solid. They had absolutely no idea they were holding fossilized tree resin, no notion of terpenoids or polymer chains or buried forests older than imagination itself. Some of them were fairly certain, in fact, that they were holding something that had fallen directly out of the sun. And that is exactly where we're headed next, back through thousands of years of human history to the very first people who ever picked up a stone like this one, held it up to the light and had absolutely no idea what they were actually holding. Long before anyone called it amber at all, someone somewhere needed an explanation for it. People have never been very good at leaving a mystery alone, have they? Especially not a mystery. This beautiful warm to the touch, catching the light, the way honey catches a spoon, and somehow older than every other stone lying beside it on the same river bank. Hold a piece of it up to a window, and something in it seems to glow back at you faintly, as though the light itself had been trapped inside years before you ever picked it up. Perhaps nowhere fell harder for that particular mystery than ancient Greece. According to a story that travelled through generations of Greek poets, long before anyone bothered writing it down there, once was a young man named Phaethon, son of Helios, the god who dragged the sun itself across the sky every single day in a blazing chariot. Phaethon, being young enough to believe he was owed a favour larger than he could possibly handle, begged his father for a single afternoon behind the reins. Helios, against every reasonable instinct a parent is supposed to have agreed. It did not go well. Phaethon lost control of that chariot almost immediately, dragging the sun far too near the earth, in some places scorching entire rivers dry and swinging it too far away in others, plunging whole regions into sudden frost. To stop him before he set the entire world ablaze, Zeus, king of the gods, struck the runaway chariot from the sky with a single thunderbolt. Phaethon fell burning into a river far below one the old poets called the Eridanus. His sisters, a group of nymphs known as the Heliades, gathered along that river bank and wept for him without stopping day after day, until the gods, moved by grief that simply refused to end, transformed them into poplar trees, rooted forever at the water's edge. Even as trees, though, they could not stop crying. Their tears, the story goes, kept falling into the river below, and slowly, patiently over time hardened into amber. I have always found something oddly touching about that detail, even knowing perfectly well it is a myth and not a chemistry lesson. Whoever first told that story was almost certainly holding a real piece of amber in their own hand, at some point turning it over, noticing how it looked exactly like a tear caught mid-fall, and reaching for the only kind of explanation available to them at the time. Not science, grief. The Greeks were not even fully settled on that explanation, by the way. Some ancient writers seriously proposed that amber was, and I promise I am not making this up, the solidified urine of a lynx, which tells you two things rather clearly. First, that ancient naturalists were doing their absolute best with the tools available to them. Second, that grief apparently made for a far more popular explanation than biology, seeing as the tear story is the one that actually survived the centuries. That word tears is not even amber's most famous legacy, as it turns out. That particular honour belongs to a different Greek word entirely, one you've almost certainly used yourself today, without ever once realising where it came from. The Greeks called amber electron, and centuries before anyone understood what electricity even was, one philosopher, a man named Thales of Miletus, sometime around the 6th century before the Common Era, noticed something rather strange about it. Rub a piece of amber briskly against a scrap of wool or fur, and it begins pulling small light objects toward itself. Bits of straw feathers dust seemingly out of nowhere. If you have ever rubbed balloon against your own hair as a child just to watch it stand straight up afterward, you've already personally recreated the exact same experiment, roughly 26 centuries later, almost certainly without a single thought for the Greek philosopher who noticed it first. Thales had no framework at all for explaining why it happened. There was no concept yet of static charge, no notion of particles carrying invisible force. None of the vocabulary science would eventually build around this exact phenomenon. He simply noted the pulling effect, wrote about this strange stone that seemed to reach out and grab things, and moved on, likely as puzzled as everyone else around him. That observation sat quietly in the historical record for roughly 2,000 years, mentioned occasionally, mostly treated as an amusing party trick, until an English physician named William Gilbert sat down, sometime around the year 1600, to study magnetism seriously, perhaps for the first time in a truly systematic way. Gilbert needed a word to describe this amber-like pulling force he kept observing in other materials as well, and rather than invent something entirely new, he reached back for that old Greek word electron and coined the Latin term electricus to describe it. Barely a century later, that word had drifted into English as electricity, which means, and I think this one is worth sitting with for a moment, every single time you flip a light switch, charge a phone, or grumble about your internet going out, you are technically quietly invoking the name of a fossilized drop of tree sap that some Bronze Age trader was probably wearing around his neck at the time. Long before Rome ever entered this story, amber had already been travelling extraordinary distances for well over 1,000 years. Archaeologists have pulled Baltic amber beads out of Mycenaean Greek tombs dating back to the Bronze Age, and out of ancient Egyptian burial sites as well. Quiet evidence of trade networks stretching across an entire continent, centuries before anyone had invented money the way we would recognize it today, let alone a proper road. Homer himself, composing the stories that would eventually become the Iliad and the Odyssey, mentioned amber, directly ranking it in value just below gold, and calling it fittingly enough by that very same word electron. The Romans, for their part, cared rather less about where amber's name came from, and rather more about how much of it they could get their hands on. Long trade routes, remembered today collectively as the Amber Road, stretched from the shores of the Baltic Sea in the north, down through Central Europe, all the way to the Mediterranean coastline, carrying amber south for well over 1,000 years before Rome ever properly entered the picture. By the height of the Roman Empire, demand for it had turned into something bordering on obsession. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, who documented an enormous amount of the natural world during his lifetime, recorded one particular expedition commissioned under the Emperor Nero. A Roman knight was sent all the way north to the Baltic coast for the sole purpose of gathering as much amber as a single journey could carry, back meant to decorate an upcoming set of gladiatorial games. According to Pliny, the knight succeeded well beyond anyone's expectation, returning with such an enormous quantity that the protective netting separating spectators from wild animals in the arena was studded with amber, along with the weapons carried that day, and even the funeral decorations prepared for anyone who failed to survive the games. Pliny also noted, with what reads a little like disapproval even across 2,000 years, that a small amber figurine could be worth more in Rome at the time than a healthy grown man sold into slavery. Make of that particular comparison whatever you would like. I certainly have thoughts about it, though I suspect you can probably guess most of them without my needing to say another word. Not everyone along that trade route shared Rome's obsession, interestingly enough. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing toward the end of the 1st century, described a Baltic people he called the Aestii, who lived directly along that amber-rich shoreline, and who apparently gathered the stuff straight off the beach after storms, calling it glizum in their own language. Tacitus, with the casual condescension so many Roman writers reserve for anyone living outside their own empire, claimed these people had never bothered asking what the substance actually was, or where it came from, and seemed almost bewildered by the enormous price Roman traders were willing to pay for it. Reading that passage now, centuries later, I find myself far less interested in what it says about the Aestii, and considerably more interested in what it says about Rome. An entire empire dazzled beyond reason by a stone that the people living right beside it barely considered worth bending down for, until someone from far away decided quite arbitrarily that it should be precious. Beyond decoration, amber carried real medical weight in the ancient world too, at least by the standards ancient medicine had to work with. Pliny wrote that amber worn as a necklace was believed to ease swollen glands and sore throats, a belief that persisted for centuries across large parts of Europe. If that sounds oddly familiar to any parent watching this tonight, it might be because a version of that exact belief is still floating around today in the form of amber teething necklaces marketed to soothe babies cutting their very first teeth. Modern medical organizations, it is worth saying, plainly advise against them, not because the amber itself carries any danger, but because of the very real choking and strangulation risk a necklace poses to an infant left unsupervised even for a moment. It is a strange thing watching a belief travel 2,000 years mostly intact arriving in the modern world, only to run head first into modern safety standards. The stone itself never changed not even slightly across all that time. We simply learned a great deal more about the baby wearing it. Amber's fame did not fade with the collapse of Rome either. If anything, it only grew more elaborate as the centuries passed, reaching what might be its single, most extraordinary expression, sometime in the early 1700s inside the royal court of Prussia. Their master craftsmen spent years constructing an entire chamber walls, and all out of intricately carved amber panels backed with gold leaf and mirrors, designed to glow warmly from within the moment candlelight touched it. In the year 1716, the King of Prussia gave this astonishing room away in its entirety, offering it as a diplomatic gift to the visiting Tsar of Russia, sealing an alliance between the two nations in about the most extravagant way either monarch could possibly imagine. The room eventually found a permanent home inside the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, and for more than 2 centuries it stood there as one of the most celebrated interiors on the entire planet, nicknamed without much exaggeration the 8th wonder of the world. Then, in 1941, invading soldiers dismantled the entire chamber in under 2 days, packed its glowing amber panels into dozens of wooden crates and shipped them west. The room went briefly on public display once more inside a castle along the Baltic coast, and then somewhere in the closing chaos of that war it disappeared completely. Nobody alive today knows with any real certainty what actually happened to it. Some believe it was destroyed in the bombing that levelled much of that same coastline. Others believe fragments of it are still hidden somewhere in a forgotten bunker, an old mine shaft, a cellar nobody has thought to search properly in decades. A careful, faithful reconstruction was eventually completed in the early 2000s, built from old photographs and an enormous amount of patient guesswork, and visitors can walk through that copy today. But the original, some 6 tons of 18th century amber, remains one of the most sought-after missing treasures anywhere in the world, mentioned in the same breath as stolen paintings and sunken gold, all because a handful of Prussian craftsmen once decided that ordinary walls were simply not good enough. Meanwhile, on the entirely other side of the world, without a single shred of contact between the two civilizations, an entirely separate culture arrived at its own explanation, and it is in its own quiet way just as poetic as anything the Greeks ever came up with. In China, amber became known as hupo, a name that roughly translates to tiger's soul. According to ancient belief, when a tiger died, its spirit sank down into the earth and slowly transformed into solid stone. Physicians writing many centuries later, including the well-known Ming Dynasty scholar Li Shizhen in his sprawling medical compendium, repeated this same explanation almost without alteration, describing amber quite plainly as the spirit of a tiger returned to solid form. And it was never simply decorative there either. Traditional Chinese medicine incorporated amber directly into treatment, prescribed in small, careful amounts to calm a restless spirit, ease anxiety, and rather fittingly, given what you happen to be doing with your evening right now, help settle a troubled mind towards sleep. Which means this exact stone in 2 completely unconnected corners of the ancient world ended up serving two strikingly similar purposes: decorating royalty on one side of the earth, and helping exhausted, anxious people quiet their minds enough to rest on the other. It makes me wonder, honestly, whether you have ever held a piece of amber yourself. Maybe in an old necklace passed down from a grandmother, or a ring picked up somewhere on vacation years ago, without ever really stopping to ask where it came from, or how old the thing resting against your skin actually was. If you have, I would love to know down in the comments whether you knew any of this at the time, or whether it was simply a pretty stone to you the same way it was to almost everyone who ever wore one before the science finally caught up. What strikes me most looking back across all of these different explanations, the tears of grieving sisters, the pulling force that fascinated a philosopher, the soul of a dying tiger settling into the ground, an entire room built to hold candlelight inside solid gold-coloured stone, is not that any of them turned out to be correct. None of them were not remotely. What strikes me is that every single culture that ever encountered this stone reached for the exact same kind of explanation. Not chemistry, not geology, something closer to sentiment. Something that could explain not just what amber was, but why it felt like it mattered so much to hold in the first place. Why people kept crossing mountains for it, gifting entire rooms built from it, and tucking it gently around the necks of their own children. Maybe that instinct was not so far off in the end, because it would take thousands of years, an enormous amount of patient laboratory work, and one rather ordinary afternoon at a market in the mountains of northern Myanmar for anyone to finally understand what these small golden stones had actually been quietly holding on to the entire time. That afternoon began the way most ordinary afternoons do, without any warning at all that anything remarkable was about to happen. The year was 2015. The place was a mountain town called Mid-Cretaceous, tucked into the far northern reaches of Myanmar, near enough to the Chinese border that you could feel two very different worlds brushing against each other in the same street market. This region, Kachin State, is famous among collectors for two things pulled straight out of its own soil: jade and amber, both hauled down from remote mining valleys and sold in bustling stalls to traders, tourists, and the occasional scientist wandering through with a very different agenda than everyone else around him. Some of that amber, as it happens, had travelled down from the very same forested valley we spent our very first story inside, carried out of the ground and into rows of folding tables long before anyone waiting there had any idea what some of it actually contained. If you're picturing a khaki hat and a leather bullwhip right about now, I am sorry to disappoint you. Real paleontology looks a great deal less like an adventure film and a great deal more like a patient, slightly dusty man squinting at rocks under fluorescent stall lighting, which is more or less exactly what was happening that particular afternoon. Picture rows of folding tables stretched down a narrow street, awnings pulled low against the heat. The air thick with the smell of motorbike exhaust grilled street food, and something faintly resinous drifting up from bins of raw uncut stone. Traders called out prices in overlapping dialects, weighing rough amber nodules in their palms, the way a jeweller might weigh gold, while beside them other stalls sold jade of every shade from milky white to deep, almost electric green. Somewhere in the middle of all that noise and colour stood a man most of the vendors probably assumed was just another curious tourist turning pieces of amber over in his hands a little longer than most people usually bothered to. The man doing the squinting was a paleontologist named Lida Singh, based at the China University of Geosciences in Beijing, and by that point in his career he had already built a reputation for himself in a rather unusual corner of the field. Not digging up bones from open desert quarries the way most people picture fossil hunting, but combing through markets exactly like this one, searching raw amber for hidden treasures that most sellers around him had absolutely no idea they were holding. He had spent years training his eye for this particular kind of work, learning the subtle difference between an ordinary trapped beetle and something considerably rarer. And over the years that followed this one afternoon, he would go on to help describe an entire hidden menagerie of ancient creatures preserved in amber exactly like this. A small, patient career built almost entirely on paying closer attention than everyone else standing at the same market table. Because here is the strange truth about amber trading in this part of the world, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. The overwhelming majority of amber pulled out of the ground here is destined for one single purpose. It gets cut polished and turned into jewellery. Rings, pendants, small carved ornaments sold to tourists who like the warm honey-coloured glow of the stone and rarely ask what, if anything, might be trapped inside it. Somewhere in that enormous flow of raw material passing through markets like this one, every single week, pieces containing truly extraordinary fossils are almost certainly being sliced straight through by a jewellery saw without anyone on either side of that transaction ever knowing what was lost. Scientists who study this trade closely tend to agree on one uncomfortable point, that a meaningful number of fossils just as significant as the one in this story are lost this exact way year after year, cut into beads before a single trained eye ever gets the chance to look twice, which is exactly why a trained eye wandering through a market like this one matters so much. This is in fact how a great deal of Burmese amber paleontology actually works quietly, almost entirely through markets and private traders, rather than through neat controlled excavation sites the way you might picture fossil hunting elsewhere in the world. Scientists build relationships with dealers, learn which stalls tend to carry material from which mines, and essentially rely on patient repeat visits, the same way a regular customer gets to know a good bakery. It is a strange, sometimes uneasy way to do serious science buying history, back one small transaction at a time, and it raises questions worth sitting with. Honestly, questions we will come back to properly a little further into tonight's story. For now, though, the important thing is simply this. On this particular afternoon that trained eye landed on one piece in particular, a vendor set it down on the table between them, a lump of amber roughly the size and shape of a dried apricot warm gold, and faintly translucent, catching the light the way all good amber does. Suspended inside it, visible if you looked closely enough, were a couple of small ancient ants frozen mid-stride, and beside them something else. A small tuft of fuzzy brown material curled slightly with a texture that did not quite match anything either man had seen inside amber before. The vendor, going purely off instinct and years of handling raw amber, offered the explanation that made the most sense to him. Plant matter, probably a bit of moss or fern caught in the resin, the same way it had caught those two ants beside it. Leader Xing lifted the piece toward the light spilling in through the stall's open awning, turning it slowly between his fingers, the unhurried way you might turn a snow globe, just to watch everything inside it resettle. The market noise around him kept going exactly as it had a moment earlier, vendors calling out prices somewhere, a motorbike engine coughing to life, none of it slowing down even slightly for the quiet private moment happening at this one particular table. And something about that plant explanation did not sit right with him. Plant fibres, even preserved ones, tend to lie flat or twist in fairly loose, irregular directions. What he was looking at instead had a faint sense of structure to it, a subtle segmented rhythm running along its length, the kind of pattern you do not typically find growing on a fern. It looked in a way he could not immediately explain, even to himself, less like something that had drifted onto the sap by accident, and a great deal more like something that had once been attached to a living creature. He did not know yet in that exact moment, standing at that exact table, precisely what he was looking at. What he did know with a kind of certainty that only years of staring at thousands of ordinary amber samples can give a person was that this particular piece was not ordinary at all. There was no dramatic announcement, no gasp loud enough to turn heads at neighbouring stalls. Just a quiet, deliberate decision made in a matter of seconds to buy the piece, before anyone else at that market had the chance to notice what he had just noticed. Money changed hands a modest amount by most standards, nowhere near what this small stone would eventually turn out to be worth to science, and the vendor moved on to the next customer, almost certainly without giving the transaction a second thought. I think about that moment more than I probably should, honestly. Not the scientific part of it, the identification, the training, the years of expertise that made this recognition possible in the first place. The human part, the very specific feeling of standing in a crowded, noisy market, holding something warm and unremarkable looking in your palm, and quietly realizing that everyone else around you has absolutely no idea what they're looking at while you very much do. Have you ever felt anything like that yourself? Maybe not with a 99-million-year-old fossil, but with anything at all, a book pulled off a dusty shelf at a garage sale, a coin rattling around in an old jacket pocket, a piece of furniture someone was about to throw away. That particular flavour of quiet, private astonishment does not seem to care how large or small the discovery actually is. It feels remarkably similar every single time. That small internal jolt of knowing something the room around you does not. There is something else worth noticing here too, something I find myself coming back to. Recognition like this rarely happens by accident, no matter how casual it might have looked from the outside. Leader Singh did not simply get lucky standing at that particular table. He got lucky in the very specific way that only comes after years of showing up looking closely and training an eye to notice one detail out of place among 1,000 ordinary ones. Luck in stories like this one tends to look a great deal more like preparation wearing a very convincing disguise. Singh purchased the piece, and rather than simply keeping it in a private collection, the way so much amber passing through markets like this one ends up, he pushed for something more, urging a research institution, the Dexu Institute of Paleontology, to acquire it, formally ensuring the specimen would be preserved, documented and studied properly, rather than quietly disappearing into someone's jewellery box. What followed was not a single dramatic breakthrough, but a slow, careful, almost bureaucratic sort of magic, the kind that rarely makes it into movies about scientific discovery, but truly deserves more credit than it gets. The piece needed to travel. It needed a team. It eventually made its way into the hands of a paleontologist named Ryan McKellar, working out of the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, all the way across the world in Canada, a specialist in exactly this kind of amber analysis, someone who had spent a career learning how to interpret these golden little time capsules the way the rest of us might make sense of a paragraph of plain text. An international collaboration slowly assembled itself around this one small piece of amber researchers from China, from Canada, from the United Kingdom, each bringing a different piece of expertise to the table. Support for the work came in part from a well-known geographic research society, the kind whose yellow-bordered magazine you've almost certainly seen sitting on a coffee table at some point in your life. And quietly, patiently away from any headlines at all, this small team began the long process of figuring out exactly what Leader Singh had actually stumbled across in that market stall. Months of careful, unglamorous work followed, comparing this specimen against everything already known about feather structure, cross-checking it against the handful of other feathered inclusions ever recovered from amber anywhere in the world, debating cautiously exactly how confident the team could responsibly be before putting their names on a claim this significant. Science at its best moves at precisely this pace, slow, sceptical of itself, checking its own homework more than once before it dares say anything out loud. By the time the team finally felt ready to publish their findings in a respected journal called Current Biology, toward the end of that same year, the small stone from that market table had been measured, scanned, and studied more thoroughly than almost anything else that came through Mid-Cretaceous that particular season. I want to pause here on something I find almost more remarkable than the fossil itself, if I am being completely honest with you. This piece very nearly did not survive to become part of that story at all. It came within one transaction, one slightly less curious buyer. One ordinary afternoon at one ordinary stall of being cut, shaped and sold as a pendant, somewhere out there in markets, exactly like this one in towns. Most of us will never visit pieces just as significant as this one, are very likely being sold that same way right now this week, to someone who simply wanted a pretty piece of jewellery and had no reason at all to look twice. We only know about this particular piece because one specific person happened to be standing at that exact table on that exact afternoon, already primed by years of training to notice the one detail that did not quite fit. That is not really a story about luck if you think about it carefully. It is a story about attention, about the strange quiet power of someone who has spent enough time looking closely at ordinary things to finally recognize the one that is not ordinary at all. By the time all of that patient behind-the-scenes work had wrapped up, the small amber piece from that market table in Mid-Cretaceous was no longer simply an amber piece from a market table in Mid-Cretaceous. It had a research team behind it. It had scanning equipment pointed at it. Equipment capable of seeing straight through solid stone without ever having to cut it open. And it had sitting quietly inside it structures that were about to make headlines in newsrooms, far larger than anyone in that market could possibly have imagined that particular afternoon. And headlines in the end is exactly what followed. Within days of the findings becoming public, newspapers and broadcasters on nearly every continent were running some version of the same extraordinary sentence. A dinosaur's tail feathers intact, found preserved in amber, something no one had ever managed to document quite this clearly before. Photographs of that small golden stone travelled further and faster in a single week than the paleontologist who found it had travelled in his entire career up to that point. For a brief strange moment, an ordinary afternoon at a market table in northern Myanmar had become one of the most talked about scientific stories on the entire planet. None of that had happened yet, though not in this part of the story. All that existed for now was a market vendor's honest, reasonable guess about a bit of fuzzy plant matter, and one paleontologist walking away with a small warm stone in his pocket, and a very strong feeling that he needed to look at it a great deal more closely, which is exactly where we're headed next, into the machines, the scans, and the careful science that finally revealed precisely what had been sitting inside that stone all along. Here is a problem that does not come up very often in most scientific fields. You have sitting on a table in front of you quite possibly the single most important fossil your entire career will ever produce, and you're not allowed to touch it. Not really. Certainly not cut into it the way a surgeon might cut into tissue to see what lies beneath. One wrong move with a blade, one careless attempt to get a better look, and you could destroy the very thing you're trying to study permanently in a matter of seconds. So how exactly do you look inside a sealed piece of stone without ever opening it? The answer researchers eventually turned to is technology most of us already know from an entirely different context: a hospital. Computed tomography, the same basic principle behind the machines doctors use to look inside a broken bone without cutting the skin open, sends thousands of thin X-ray images through an object from every possible angle, then stitches those images back together into a complete three-dimensional picture. Point that same technology at a piece of amber instead of a human body, and suddenly researchers could rotate this 99-million-year-old tale on a screen zoom into individual bones, and study details invisible to the naked eye, all without so much as scratching the surface of the stone protecting it. For the finest details, the kind an ordinary hospital scanner simply is not built to catch, the team also turned to something considerably more powerful, a synchrotron, a facility that accelerates particles to produce extraordinarily bright, tightly focused beams of radiation normally reserved for physics experiments involving subjects a great deal less charming than a dinosaur's tail. Somewhere, presumably, a particle physicist looked up from an actual atom smasher one afternoon to find paleontologists borrowing the equipment to study feathers, and I would honestly love to have seen that particular conversation play out. What that scanning revealed piece by careful piece turned out to be even more remarkable than anyone standing at that market table in Mid-Cretaceous could possibly have guessed. Buried inside this small golden fragment were 8 individual vertebrae tiny segments of tailbone, each one roughly the size of a single grain of rice. Researchers studying the specimen believe the complete tail, back when this animal was still walking around, may have originally contained more than 25 vertebrae total, stretching out long and thin behind the body the way a lizard's tail does today. What survived inside this particular piece of amber, in other words, was never meant to represent the whole story. It was a fragment, a chapter torn out of a much longer book, the rest of which is presumably still out there, somewhere unrecovered or lost entirely to time. That detail about the bones turned out to matter enormously for a reason that might not be obvious right away. Modern birds, along with their closest relatives near the end of the age of dinosaurs, do not have tails built quite like this one. Toward the tip of a bird's tail, the individual vertebrae fuse together into a single solid structure, a small compact bone called a pygostyle, which acts almost like the base of a fan, letting a bird control every tail feather as one coordinated unit rather than moving each bone individually. It is part of what makes a bird's tail so aerodynamically efficient, and part of why a sparrow can flick its tail feathers into a dozen different positions in the time it takes you to blink. The vertebrae inside this amber showed absolutely no sign of that fusion at all. Each bone remained separate, flexible, distinctly reptilian in structure, closer in spirit to the tail of a monitor lizard than to anything perched outside your window this evening, which meant almost immediately that whatever this feathered tail belonged to it was not a bird, not in any technical sense that actually matters to a scientist. It was something positioned earlier stranger and considerably more interesting on the family tree, a genuine dinosaur, feathers and all. Once the bones had answered that particular question, attention turned to the feathers themselves, and this is where the story quietly becomes, at least to me, even more moving than the bones ever were. Feathers, if you have never had a reason to think about their structure before, are built in layers. There is usually a strong central shaft running down the middle called a rachis, and branching off that shaft smaller filaments called barbs, and branching off those barbs even smaller hooked filaments called barbules, which zip neighbouring barbs together the way a zipper pulls fabric into one continuous surface. That interlocking structure is precisely what allows a modern bird's flight feather to hold its shape against rushing air, instead of simply falling apart mid-flight. Run your finger along the edge of any feather you happen to have lying around the house, and you can actually feel that zipping mechanism working, smoothing itself right back into place the instant you let go. The feathers preserved in this amber did not have that strong central shaft at all. What they had instead was something closer to a soft layered plume, barbs and barbules clearly present and clearly organized, but without the rigid spine running through the middle that a flying bird depends on so completely. Picture the difference between a stiff structured quill pen feather and a soft fluffy down feather, and you are most of the way toward picturing the texture involved here. Under magnification, researchers could see the barbules still holding their shape, After 99 million years, tiny overlapping hooks exactly the way they would appear on a feather freshly plucked from a bird alive today, just built around a softer, less rigid frame. This detail matters a great deal to anyone trying to understand how feathers evolved in the first place, a question scientists had long struggled with before this fossil turned up. There were two competing possibilities on the table. Perhaps that strong central shaft came first, evolutionarily speaking, with the softer branching structure developing later. Or perhaps it happened the other way around entirely, with soft barbed shaftless plumage, appearing first only for a stiffer central spine to evolve afterward, once flight itself became the priority worth building toward. This particular tail, with its clearly developed barbs and barbules, but no meaningful shaft to speak of, leans rather firmly toward that second explanation. Feathers, it turns out, were very likely soft and fluffy, long before they were ever built for flying. Flight came later, layered on top of a structure that already existed for entirely different reasons: insulation most likely, or display, or simply keeping a small animal warm through cold Cretaceous nights. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment if you feel like it. What do you picture in your own head when someone says the word dinosaur scaly? Grey or green, or some dull reptilian brown? That image did not come from nowhere. For most of the history of paleontology, artists reconstructing dinosaurs had absolutely no reliable evidence for skin texture or colour at all, and simply guessed reasonably enough based on modern reptiles. This fossil is part of a small, remarkable handful of specimens that quietly rewrote that entire assumption, because for once guessing was not required. If you grew up with a particular dinosaur book or toy that coloured everything the same murky green, I would honestly be curious to hear about it down in the comments, since I suspect a great many of us were handed roughly the same mental picture as children, whether or not it ever actually matched reality. Under an extremely powerful microscope, researchers studying this tail identified structures called melanosomes, microscopic pigment, producing components that once lived inside living feather cells, and whose exact shape corresponds remarkably reliably to specific colours in living birds today. Round melanosomes tend to correspond to reddish or chestnut tones. Longer, more elongated ones tend to correspond to darker, blacker shades. By comparing the melanosome shapes preserved in this amber against a large reference library built from modern feathers of known colour, researchers were able to reconstruct with genuine scientific confidence what this animal actually looked like. Not an artist's impression, an answer. The tail, it turns out, was chestnut brown along its upper surface, fading into pale, almost white plumage underneath. That particular pattern, dark on top, pale underneath, has a name, and it shows up across an enormous range of animals alive today, from deer to sharks to countless species of bird. It is called countershading, and it works as a remarkably elegant kind of camouflage. Seen from above against dark earth or shadowed undergrowth, the darker back blends into the background. Seen from below against a bright sky, the pale belly does the same thing in reverse. A predator looking down and a predator looking up both come away slightly less likely to notice you. You have almost certainly seen this exact pattern yourself, without ever putting a name to it, on a white-tailed deer grazing at the edge of a backyard, on a penguin gliding through open water, on a great white shark cutting silently beneath a surfboard. Nature appears to have landed on this particular trick independently over and over again across wildly unrelated branches of the family tree, which tends to be a fairly strong sign that it works. Finding that exact pattern on a dinosaur this small strongly suggests it was not sitting comfortably at the top of its own particular food chain, It was almost certainly something else's potential meal, doing everything its own small body could manage to avoid becoming one. I want to be honest with you about one small gap in this story too, because I think the honesty matters more than a perfectly tidy answer would. When researchers examined the pale underside more closely, they could not actually find melanosomes there at all, not in the same way they found them across the darker upper surface. Which leaves an honest open question. Was that pale underside naturally unpigmented, simply white by default, the way certain patches of fur or feather can be? Or did it rely on some entirely different colouring method, one that does not preserve nearly as well across 99 million years? Nobody currently knows for certain, and I would rather tell you that plainly than pretend this story wraps up with every single loose end perfectly accounted for. Real science, more often than the movies would ever you believe, ends most of its sentences with an honest, unresolved shrug. There was one more discovery buried in this small piece of amber, and it might be the detail I personally find most quietly overwhelming out of everything we have covered so far tonight. Chemical analysis of the tissue surrounding those tiny bones turned up faint traces of iron, the specific kind of iron chemistry left behind by hemoglobin, the very molecule responsible for carrying oxygen through blood in living animals, including yours right now as you listen to this. Not a symbol of blood, not an artist's guess at blood, an actual chemical fingerprint of it left behind in a body that stopped breathing longer before the first flowering plant ever existed on this planet. Sit with that for just a moment if you would. We're not simply looking at the shape of an animal that once lived. We're looking in some very real chemical sense at a fragment of what once kept it alive. There is something almost uncomfortably intimate about that if you let yourself think about it for more than a few seconds. Most of what survives from the deep past reaches us as the outline only a silhouette, a shadow, cast by something that is otherwise completely gone. This is different. This is closer to a fingerprint left on a doorframe, still there, still chemically itself, long after the hand that made it has vanished entirely. If you had to guess before tonight how much of an animal this old could possibly still exist, in any physical chemical sense, would 99 million years have even crossed your mind as a realistic answer? I will admit it would not have crossed mine. Not before I properly understood what a piece of amber like this one is actually capable of holding on to, which brings us gently back to a question we left sitting unresolved several stories ago now. What actually happened to this particular little creature in the final moments before that resin sealed permanently around its tail? Most researchers who have studied this specimen closely suspect, though they are careful never to claim it outright, that the animal likely did not survive the encounter, that its tail was caught deeply enough and held firmly enough that struggling free may never have been a realistic option at all. It remains an educated guess rather than a certainty, the same honest kind of not quite knowing we have already made peace with more than once tonight. But it does add a quiet, sombre little frame around everything else we now understand about this tale, the bones, the barbs, the colour, the blood. All of it belonged, if only briefly, to something that was almost certainly frightened and almost certainly alone, on one particular afternoon that turned out to matter more than anyone involved could possibly have known at the time. None of this, the fused bones that were not fused, the feathers without a shaft, the counter-shaded colouring, the chemistry of actual blood would have been visible at all in an ordinary fossil pressed flat into rock. It took amber specifically and everything strange and patient about the way amber preserves a moment to make a discovery quite this detailed possible in the first place. A skeleton in a museum case can tell you the shape of an animal. This small golden stone told researchers something closer to a portrait texture posture, even the particular shade of brown it wore into that final afternoon. Which raises a rather natural question of its own, one I think is worth carrying forward with us. If feathers this soft and this primitive already existed on a creature that clearly could not fly, what does that actually tell us about how flight itself eventually got started? Feathers, it turns out, may have had absolutely nothing to do with flying, at least not at first. So where did they actually come from, and how does a floppy, shaftless little tail like this one connect to the sharp, aerodynamic wings we associate with birds, today the ones capable of crossing oceans without a single stop along the way? That is precisely the puzzle waiting for us next. Most of us grow up picturing evolution as a kind of ladder. A single tidy staircase, one species quietly improving into the next step after step until eventually you arrive at whatever the finished product happens to be. It is a comforting image, the kind that fits neatly into a textbook diagram or a museum wall chart. It is also, in the case of feathers, almost completely wrong. What actually happened looks a great deal less like a staircase, and a great deal more like an overgrown garden. Dozens of different branches sprouting off in dozens of different directions, at once tangled, competing for the same sunlight, most of them never leading anywhere near flight at all, simply solving some other smaller problem an animal happened to be facing at the time. Nature, it turns out, was never trying to build a bird. Nature was simply solving one small immediate problem after another, and every so often, almost by accident, one of those small solutions turned out to be useful for something enormous down the line. Researchers studying feather evolution generally break that messy garden down into a handful of recognizable stages, and I think laying them out plainly is worth a few minutes of your evening, because once you can picture them, this entire story starts to click into place in a rather satisfying way. It begins with something closer to a simple hollow filament, not unlike a coarse strand of hair growing straight up out of the skin, probably doing little more than trapping a thin layer of warm air near the body. From there, a small cluster of those filaments might sprout from a single point, forming a soft, unstructured tuft, something closer to a shaving brush than anything you would call a feather today. Only later does a version appear with proper branching structure, the barbs and barbules we spent so much time on already, but still without any central shaft holding it all together, soft and plume, like closer to down than to a flight feather, the exact texture you might find stuffed inside a warm winter jacket. Later still, a rigid shaft finally develops down the middle, giving the whole structure a symmetrical feather-shaped outline for the very first time. And only at the very end of that long sequence does a feather become properly asymmetrical, one side of the shaft noticeably wider than the other, the exact aerodynamic trick that finally makes true flight possible, the same basic shape you would recognize instantly on a hawk or a pigeon today. Our little tale from the last story we told sits fairly early along that entire sequence. Barbs present, barbules present, rachis essentially absent, which places it in evolutionary terms somewhere in the soft, fluffy middle of that garden, nowhere near the flight-ready end of it at all. Here is where the story gets truly strange, though, and I would love to know down in the comments whether this next part surprises you, as much as it surprised me the first time I properly understood the timing involved. Roughly a century before any of this Burmese amber existed, in the summer of 1861, workers in a limestone quarry in southern Germany, near a town called Solnhofen, uncovered something that would go on to become one of the single most famous fossils in the history of science. That same fine-grained limestone had already been quarried for centuries by that point, first by Romans, later by printers prized for a surface smooth enough to hold the finest possible detail when pressed with ink. Nobody working that quarry in the middle of the 19th century was looking for fossils at all. They were looking for perfectly flat, perfectly clean stone. What they found instead was a single isolated feather, at first followed within weeks by an almost complete skeleton wings, and all pressed into that same pale stone with astonishing clarity. The timing could not have landed more perfectly if someone had planned it. Charles Darwin had published his theory of evolution by natural selection barely 2 years earlier, and here apparently right on cue was a creature that looked for all the world like exactly the kind of transitional animal his theory predicted should exist somewhere in the fossil record. Scaly reptilian legs, a long bony lizard-like tail, clawed fingers poking out partway along each wing, a delicate wishbone tucked into its chest, the very same forked little bone you might snap for luck over a holiday dinner at that point believed to exist only in birds, and yet unmistakably feathers fully formed fanned out along both wings, in the same asymmetrical shape you would find on a hawk gliding over a highway today. Scientists named the creature Archaeopteryx, and it very quickly became a battleground. Thomas Henry Huxley, one of Darwin's fiercest and most capable defenders, held the fossil up as living proof that evolution's predicted transitional animals were not merely theoretical. Richard Owen, a brilliant anatomist who never fully accepted Darwin's theory, saw the very same skeleton and argued it was simply an unusual, isolated bird, nothing more, with no real bearing on the debate raging around it. The country physician who first acquired the skeleton, reportedly in exchange for medical treatment he had provided, eventually sold it on to a museum collection for a sum many times larger than his entire yearly income from practicing medicine. That particular argument over what exactly Archaeopteryx proves and what it does not has never entirely stopped since more than a century and a half later. It actually took well over 100 years for one crucial piece of that argument to finally settle, and the fossil that settled it came from an entirely different country, discovered by an entirely different kind of person. In 1996, a farmer named Li Yumin, working land near a village in Liaoning province in northeastern China, uncovered a small cat-sized skeleton, unlike anything scientists had officially confirmed before a genuine non-avian dinosaur closely related to nothing that could fly covered head to tail in short, simple, fuzzy filaments. Word of the find reached an American paleontologist named John Ostrom, who had spent decades quietly arguing that birds descended from dinosaurs largely without enough physical proof to fully convince his skeptics. Colleagues who were there that day described him as visibly shaken, staring at photographs of a fossil that finally unambiguously proved a point he'd been defending for the better part of his career. Later analysis of that same skeleton, called Sinosauropteryx, went on to reveal something else entirely, a faint reddish-orange banding pattern, still visible along its tail, the very first time scientists had ever determined actual dinosaur colouring from anything other than pure imagination. And its feathers, every researcher who studied them agreed, were built purely for warmth. This particular dinosaur, older even than our little Burmese tail, could not fly in the slightest. Here is the detail I actually want you sitting with tonight, though. Archaeopteryx lived roughly 150 million years ago. Our little feathered tail, sealed inside Burmese amber, lived around 99 million years ago. Do the simple arithmetic for a moment, and you land on a rather startling gap of more than 50 million years standing between a creature that already had proper aerodynamic flight-ready feathers and a completely different creature that more than 50 million years later was still walking around with soft, shaftless, distinctly non-aerodynamic plumage. If evolution really did work like a tidy staircase, that timing would make absolutely no sense at all. How could flight-capable feathers already exist for 50 million years, while an entirely separate lineage was still stuck several steps behind on the exact same staircase? The honest answer is that there was never one single staircase to begin with. There were many separate branches evolving feathers for entirely different reasons, at entirely different speeds, completely independent of one another. One branch, the one that eventually led toward Archaeopteryx, and much later, every bird currently living outside your window pushed hard toward flight fairly early. Plenty of other branches never bothered pushing in that direction at all, because flight was never the point for them in the first place, which raises a rather natural question. If not flight, then what were all these other feathered dinosaurs actually using feathers for those extra 50 million years and more? Insulation is probably the simplest answer and likely the earliest one. Many small theropods appear to have been warm-blooded or at least moving in that direction, and a coat of soft filaments would have worked wonderfully as a built-in blanket trapping body heat the exact same way a sweater does for you tonight. Display almost certainly played a role too, feathers used to signal health, maturity or availability to a potential mate, in more or less the same spirit as a peacock's tail does today, just without the aerodynamics attached. But my personal favourite piece of evidence for a completely different feathered purpose comes from a fossil discovered on the opposite side of the world, from Myanmar, entirely out in the storm-scoured red dunes of the Gobi Desert in Mongolia. In 1993, a joint expedition combining researchers from the American Museum of Natural History and Mongolian scientists uncovered the skeleton of a fairly large beaked dinosaur called Sitipati, crouched directly on top of a nest full of eggs, arms spread outward along the nest's outer edge, in an oddly familiar, almost tender posture. The eggs themselves had been laid in careful, deliberate rings, several layers deep, arranged with a symmetry that still looks almost too neat to be accidental. Researchers eventually gave that particular specimen an affectionate nickname, Big Mama, and the name stuck appearing in museum placards and textbooks ever since a small warm bit of humanity attached to a creature that died protecting its young roughly 75 million years ago. That posture, arms fanned symmetrically around a clutch of eggs, is essentially unheard of anywhere in the reptile world. Crocodiles guard nests fiercely, but nothing about their bodies is built to drape protectively over eggs the way this skeleton was found. That posture is in fact instantly recognizable to anyone who has ever watched a hen settle onto her own nest. Feathers, fluffed wings held loosely open along the edges. Researchers studying the specimen concluded that Sitipati was very likely brooding its eggs, the same patient way birds do today, and that the long feathers, almost certainly documented along its arms, most likely helped trap warmth around the entire clutch, protecting the eggs the way a blanket protects a sleeping child on a cold night. Feathers, in other words, were not simply insulation for one single body. In at least this one remarkable case, they may have been insulation for an entire future generation, tucked carefully underneath a parent's outstretched arms. On the opposite side of the ancient world from the small feathered tail that started this particular story, I find something quietly moving about that particular detail, if I'm honest with you. Feathers did not begin their existence as a tool built for flying at all. They began as something closer to comfort, warmth, perhaps a small act of care extended toward eggs that had not even hatched yet. Flight arrived considerably later, almost as an afterthought, one lineage eventually discovering that a structure originally built to keep a body warm could, with the right proportions and the right shaft down the middle, also catch enough air to lift that same body clean off the ground. There is something worth carrying forward from that idea beyond dinosaurs entirely, honestly. How often does something built for one quiet, unglamorous reason end up decades or centuries later unlocking something nobody involved could have possibly predicted at the time? Evolution does not plan ahead. It simply keeps whatever happens to work, repurposes it, when opportunity allows, and lets the rest sort itself out through pure trial and error, stretched across an almost unimaginable amount of time. I sometimes wonder how often this happens in ordinary daily experience, a skill picked up for one small reason, a habit built to solve one narrow problem that ends up mattering for a completely different reason. Years down the road, one we could never have predicted at the time we first picked it up. Has anything like that ever happened in your own life? Some small skill or habit that turned out to matter for a reason you never once saw coming? I would be curious to hear about it, honestly, down in the comments once tonight's story finishes properly. So the next time someone tells you fairly confidently that dinosaurs slowly grew wings so that birds could eventually take flight, you now know the far stranger, far more interesting real version of events. Feathers came first for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with the sky. Flight was simply one branch among a great many that happened to figure out a second use for something that already existed. Most of those other branches, including quite probably the exact lineage our little amber tail belonged to, never made that particular leap at all, and eventually died out completely, leaving flight against fairly steep odds as the branch that managed to survive into the world we know today. Every single bird you have ever watched from a park bench, every pigeon crowding a sidewalk, every hawk circling somewhere above a highway, represents the one branch out of an entire overgrown garden of feathered experiments that happened to make it all the way through. All the others are gone now, preserved only in stone and amber in quarries in Germany and dunes in Mongolia, and dense forests once standing in what is now northern Myanmar, which leaves us with one particular forest in one particular corner of Cretaceous Myanmar that clearly was not short on remarkable creatures of its own. Because that same sticky resin that caught a young dinosaur's tail was, it turns out, catching a great deal more than that all across the very same stretch of forest floor in the middle of moments considerably more violent than anything we have covered tonight so far. That is exactly where we're headed next. Violence, it turns out, moves through resin exactly the same way stillness does. Slowly, completely, without any regard at all for whether the moment being preserved happens to be peaceful or absolutely brutal. Because that same forest floor in ancient Myanmar, the one that quietly swallowed the tip of a young dinosaur's tail, was busy swallowing considerably more dramatic scenes as well, all across that same stretch of ground, sometimes within a short walk of each other, sometimes probably on the very same afternoon. We tend to imagine a prehistoric forest as one continuous sweeping backdrop, a single, sprawling stage with a handful of famous main characters wandering across it. The truth, once you start looking closely at what amber from this exact region has actually produced, looks a great deal busier than that. Thousands of tiny overlapping dramas playing out simultaneously, most of them starring creatures small enough to fit comfortably on your thumbnail, each one utterly convinced in whatever passes for insect conviction that its own particular afternoon mattered enormously. Let me introduce you to a creature entomologists have given a name that tells you almost everything you need to know before we go any further. Hairlants. Not a nickname invented for a nature documentary looking for a punchy title, but the actual working name paleontologists themselves settle on formally in published scientific papers, because apparently even scientists occasionally allow themselves a little dramatic flair when the evidence plainly earns it. Picture an ordinary ant, the kind you might find marching across a picnic blanket this summer, then imagine its jaws rebuilt entirely from scratch. Modern ants bite the way you or I would bite mouth parts, closing left to right, side to side. Hell ants did something no ant alive today can manage. Their mandibles swung vertically instead, straight upward, curving toward the top of the ant's own head like a pair of matching scythes. And rising directly above those jaws on many hell ant species sat a strange, horn-shaped protrusion, jutting forward from the skull like something out of a nightmare a Victorian naturalist might have sketched after a particularly bad dinner. For more than a century after the very first hell ant fossils turned up, scientists could only guess at what that bizarre horned face was actually built for. Then in 2020, a research team led by an entomologist named Philip Barden working out of the New Jersey Institute of Technology described a single piece of Burmese amber that finally answered the question directly because it had captured the answer in the middle of actually happening. Inside that amber sat a hell ant species Ceratomyrmex ellenbergeri, its scythe-like jaws swung fully upward, clamped tight around the narrow neck of a small unlucky nymph, a young relative of the modern cockroach. The horn on the ant's head was not simply decoration. It was functioning exactly the way a butcher's block functions against a blade, a solid surface for the mandibles to pin prey against, holding the victim completely immobile the instant those jaws swept shut. Neither animal got the chance to finish whatever happened next. Somewhere in the middle of that struggle, sticky resin sealed over both of them, freezing an actual hunting strike in progress, rather than simply the aftermath of one. What makes this particular find even richer is that hell ants, it turns out, were not one single design copied across every species. Researchers studying Burmese amber have now identified roughly 16 separate hell ant species, each one experimenting with a slightly different version of the same basic vertical-jawed blueprint. Some, like the one caught mid-hunt in this fossil, simply grasped prey externally against a smooth, elongated horn. Others carried horns reinforced with something closer to a metallic edge apparently designed to pierce straight through an unlucky victim, allowing the ant to feed on the fluid inside rather than the whole creature. It is a small, strange reminder that evolution rarely settles for one clean solution when several different clumsy ones happen to work almost equally well. And then roughly 66 million years ago, alongside the dinosaurs themselves, every last one of these 16 strange horned experiments simply vanished, leaving no descendants among the ants still marching across your patio today. Dr. Barden later admitted that fossilized behavior this specific is remarkably rare in the study of ancient life, and predation caught in the exact instant it happens is rarer still. Paleontologists usually have to reconstruct hunting strategies from bones alone, educated guesswork built on tooth shape and jaw strength, the same way you might guess at a stranger's job simply from the calluses on their hands. This particular fossil handed researchers something closer to a photograph. Instead, an extinct predator caught mid-strike doing precisely what its strange anatomy had clearly evolved to do. No guesswork required at all. There is something I find quietly unsettling about that, if I am honest with you, and I suspect you might feel something similar. Our earlier story left a small deliberate gap of uncertainty in it, whether that little feathered dinosaur managed to escape or not, because the evidence simply could not tell us for certain. This fossil offers no such gap. The violence here is not a possibility researchers are weighing carefully against the evidence. It is simply sitting there, captured mid-motion, undeniable, permanent. Have you ever stopped to consider how strange it is that some moments from 99 million years ago come to us as quiet mysteries while others arrive as complete, unambiguous certainty? The same forest produced both kinds, sometimes only footsteps apart from each other. Predation was hardly the only complicated relationship that resin happened to catch red-handed either. In a separate piece of Burmese amber described back in 2012 by an entomologist named George Poynar working alongside an amber collector from Kentucky named Ron Buckley, researchers found something even rarer than a single predator mid-attack. They found an entire scene complete with supporting cast. A small male wasp belonging to a now extinct species had blundered directly into an active spider's web, one of the sticky orb-shaped traps you might recognize from your own backyard on a dewy morning. At least 15 individual strands of spider silk remain clearly visible inside the amber, today stretched taut around the trapped wasp's body, catching light the same way a real web still does when the morning sun hits it at exactly the right angle. And bearing down on that wasp caught mid-approach legs already gathering beneath it, was the spider responsible for that web, a species researchers eventually named Geratonophila burmanica, closing in for what should have been a fairly routine meal. It never got that meal. Tree resin swallowed the entire scene, predator and prey together at the precise moment the attack was unfolding, rather than before it or after it. Poyner himself later described it almost like narrating the wasp's own final thoughts, watching its approaching death, arrive only to have that death interrupted forever by a flood of golden sap. Instead, an ending stranger than anything either creature could possibly have anticipated. There is a small, almost darkly funny footnote buried inside this particular fossil, too, if you appreciate that sort of thing the way I apparently do. The exact type of wasp caught in that web belongs to a group known today for parasitizing spider eggs, laying their own young directly inside a spider's future offspring. Which means this specific spider, moments away from becoming a meal itself, in the story of another creature entirely, may well have been executing a small, entirely unintentional act of revenge. And then there is the detail that turns this single scene into something more than just one dramatic afternoon. A second spider, an adult male of that exact same species, was found trapped separately, but very nearby in what researchers believe was likely the same web. Modern spiders are famously, almost comically unsociable creatures, frequently solitary, often cannibalistic toward their own kind without a moment's hesitation. A small handful of modern species do build shared colonial webs today, tropical spiders mostly cooperating just enough to catch larger prey together, but they remain very much the exception rather than the rule across the wider spider family tree. Finding two individuals apparently sharing a single web this far back in time suggests this particular species may have practiced something closer to genuine social living, a behavior considered rare enough among spiders then or now that this small, violent scene doubles as some of the oldest direct evidence we currently have for it. One more relationship worth mentioning tonight, and this one might hit a little closer to home than either of the others, particularly if you have ever come back from a hike and spent an uncomfortable few minutes checking yourself over. In 2017, a research team led by a Spanish paleontologist named Enrique Peñalva described a fairly unglamorous but scientifically important discovery: a small hard tick tangled directly into an actual dinosaur feather, both preserved together in the same piece of Burmese amber. It was the very first direct physical proof that ticks had been feeding on feathered dinosaurs tens of millions of years before a single mammal existed for them to bother instead. Ticks themselves as a family of creatures are considerably older, still quietly biting whatever warm-blooded or scaly host happened to be available for a stretch of time reaching back well before the first dinosaur ever hatched. Feathered dinosaurs, in other words, were not the beginning of this particular story. They were simply one more meal option a very old, very patient lineage of parasites happened to stumble across along the way. A related discovery turned up a second tick species entirely, one researchers named Dinocraton draculae. Dracula's terrible tick, and one particular specimen of that species was found still visibly engorged with a very recent meal, swollen to roughly 8 times its ordinary size, round and dark against the surrounding amber, the way a tick looks after a properly thorough feeding. Whatever unfortunate feathered creature it had been feeding on somewhere nearby, in that exact same forest, quite literally had its blood preserved alongside it, sealed into permanence inside the body of the very parasite that had been drinking it. There is something almost uncomfortably ordinary about that discovery compared with the hell ant and the spider, and I mean that as a genuine compliment to it. A dramatic hunting strike or a web caught mid-ambush feels like a headline. A tick quietly feeding on a dinosaur feels like a Tuesday. But that particular ordinariness is exactly what makes it valuable. It tells us these small feathered creatures did not enjoy some kind of charmed cinematic existence, free from ordinary biological nuisance. They dealt with the same tedious, itchy, faintly irritating biological nuisances that every warm-bodied creature since has had to deal with our little tale, included quite possibly, though no direct proof of that particular detail survives. So the next time a mosquito finds you at a summer barbecue, or you spend 10 irritating minutes checking your ankles after a walk through tall grass, take a small, strange comfort in this. You're not experiencing anything new. You're simply continuing a relationship between small biting parasites and considerably larger, more important sounding creatures that has apparently been running uninterrupted for at least 99 million years. Something tells me that particular thought will not make the itching any less annoying, but perhaps it earns the mosquito a small amount of grudging historical respect the next time it ruins your evening outdoors. Put these three small scenes together, the hell ant and its cockroach, the spider and its wasp, the tick and its feather, and a rather different picture of that ancient Myanmar forest starts to come into focus. This was never simply a quiet backdrop for one dinosaur's tail to get stuck in. It was a fully functioning, thoroughly complicated ecosystem, predators hunting prey, prey occasionally getting a strange kind of revenge parasites, feeding quietly on hosts far larger than themselves, all of it happening at once, all of it utterly indifferent to whichever golden droplet happened to be falling from which particular tree on which particular afternoon. I keep coming back to how oddly democratic that resin actually was if you think about it long enough. It did not care whether it was preserving something magnificent or something almost embarrassingly small. A dinosaur's tail and a single tick both received precisely the same treatment, the same careful patient chemistry, the same 99 million years of silent waiting underground. History, at least the version written in amber, apparently does not sort its subjects by size or importance the way our own textbooks so often do. A hell ant mid-strike gets exactly as many decades of careful scientific study as a feathered dinosaur does once someone finally notices it sitting in a drawer somewhere. Which makes me wonder honestly what you would guess is still sitting out there undiscovered in some piece of amber nobody has properly examined yet. A conversation between two creatures we do not even have names for. A moment of tenderness rather than violence for once. I would love to hear your best guess down in the comments before we move any further into tonight's story. Amber, it turns out, never had any interest in preserving only the peaceful moments. It preserved whatever happened to be nearby when it fell, tenderness and violence, both without playing favourites between them even slightly. And the forest that produced our own small feathered tail was by every account the amber itself has offered so far considerably busier, considerably more dangerous and considerably stranger than a single dinosaur story alone could ever fully capture, which raises a rather natural question worth carrying forward with us now. If a single afternoon in this one forest already produced dinosaurs, hell ants, spiders and blood-engorged ticks, what else exactly might still be waiting inside all that remaining Burmese amber patiently for someone to finally notice it? An entire hidden kingdom as it happens, considerably larger and considerably stranger than even these three small scenes might suggest. That is precisely where we are headed next. Here is something worth pausing on before we go any further tonight. Most of what we call the fossil record is built from absence, a shape pressed into rock where a body used to be, a footprint with no foot left inside it, A single tooth standing in for an entire animal science we'll spend decades arguing about. Paleontology most of the time is the careful art of reconstructing a whole animal from whatever small scattered fragments happen to survive, filling in the enormous gaps with careful comparison-educated inference and no small amount of informed guesswork. The forest floor of ancient Myanmar apparently did not receive that particular memo, because scattered across that same stretch of ground alongside a dinosaur's tail, a hunting hellant and a spider mid-ambush, researchers have also pulled out snakes, frogs, crabs, mushrooms and flowers, all of it preserved with the level of completeness that would make most fossil hunters elsewhere on the planet more than a little envious. Not fragments, not outlines. Entire small creatures caught whole, sitting quietly in museum drawers today, waiting for someone to finally open the right case and notice what they are actually looking at. Let's start with the snakes, because this next fossil truly stopped me in my tracks the first time I went through the details properly. In 2018, an international research team led by paleontologist Lida Xing, the very same scientist whose eye first caught our little feathered tail at that market years earlier, described something no one had ever managed to find before anywhere on Earth. A baby snake preserved in Burmese amber, so young it may not have hatched more than a few days or even hours before the resin found it. 97 individual vertebrae survived intact along with associated ribs, though the skull itself was missing, lost at some point before the resin sealed everything else in place. Based on its size and the delicate unfinished nature of certain bones, researchers concluded this tiny animal was either still developing inside an egg or had emerged from one only very recently. Somewhere nearby in a separate piece of amber from the very same deposit, another fragment turned up a scrap of shed skin. Diamond patterned in the unmistakable way snake scales arranged themselves, hinting at a full-grown adult that may have belonged to the very same species or something closely related to it. Scientists named this tiny creature Zhouphis myanmarensis, and the vertebrae inside it remarkably look almost identical to the vertebrae you would find in a newly hatched snake today. 100 million years of evolution, and this particular piece of anatomy barely changed at all. Which tells you something rather lovely about how evolution actually works, honestly. It does not constantly reinvent every single detail of a body from scratch. Once a design solves a problem well enough, that same basic blueprint can simply keep working quietly for an almost unimaginable stretch of time largely untouched. There is a deeper scientific payoff buried in those tiny bones too, beyond simple preservation. The particular shape of this snake's vertebrae closely resembles fossil snakes previously found on entirely different continents in Argentina, in Africa, in India. At the time, this little creature was alive. Those landmasses, along with parts of what is now Australia, were still loosely connected as fragments of an ancient southern supercontinent scientists call Gondwana. Finding such a strong anatomical match here in what is now Southeast Asia hints at a slow, patient migration route carrying early snake lineages northward out of that fragmenting southern world and into what would eventually become Asia, one small population at a time, long before any human mapmaker existed to notice the journey at all. I keep picturing the scene the illustrations built for this fossil. Try to imagine small hatchlings emerging from soft leathery eggs on a warm, damp forest floor, taking their very first uncertain movements through the world with absolutely no way of knowing that a slow golden ribbon of tree sap was at that exact moment only inches away. Frogs turned up too, and their story carries its own small quiet tragedy built directly into it. Also described in 2018 this time by a research team including herpetologist David Blackburn from the Florida Museum of Natural History, a tiny juvenile frog, barely the length of your thumbnail, was found preserved beside an unidentified beetle, positioned near enough that researchers suspect the beetle may well have been the very meal that frog was chasing in its final living moment. Scientists named it Electrorunner limoe, roughly translating to amber frog, and it represents the earliest direct evidence anywhere in the world of frogs actually living inside a warm, wet tropical forest, rather than the drier, more seasonal environments most ancient frog fossils tend to come from. Frogs as a group are notoriously bad at leaving fossils behind at all. Their bones are thin, their bodies fragile, built from cartilage and delicate rod, thin limbs that crush flat or dissolve away entirely under the ordinary process of fossilization. The same warm, moist conditions that frogs love tend to be exactly the conditions that destroy a body long before it has any real chance of turning to stone properly. Most of what paleontologists know about ancient frogs as a result comes disproportionately from dry seasonal environments, where a body had a slightly better chance of drying out before decay set in, which paints a badly skewed picture of where frogs actually preferred to make their homes throughout most of their history. Amber once again simply ignored that usual rule, entirely catching a small, damp, thoroughly ordinary tropical frog in the exact kind of habitat the fossil record almost never gets to show us. Have you ever wondered, watching a frog snap at an insect in your own backyard on a summer evening, how far back that exact small drama actually stretches? 99 million years at the very least, based on what this one particular forest happened to preserve the same small, quick, slightly clumsy hunting instinct playing out then exactly as it plays out now. Then there is the crab, and I will admit this one might be my personal favourite detail of the entire evening. In 2021, researchers led by paleontologist Javier Luque described a tiny crab barely 5 millimeters across, preserved in Burmese amber, with a level of completeness researchers themselves described as remarkably unprecedented eyes, antennae, delicate mouth parts, even the gills tucked inside its own small body, all still perfectly intact. Not a single hair on its shell was missing. They named it Cretapsera athenata, a name built deliberately from two very different traditions, Creta for the Cretaceous period itself, and Apsara, a spirit of clouds and water drawn from Southeast Asian mythology, paired with athanatos, the ancient Greek word for immortal. Loosely translated, this tiny crab now carries the name Immortal Spirit of the Clouds and Waters, which strikes me as a rather beautiful thing to call something you're holding in the palm of your hand smaller than a fingernail. Its scientific importance runs just as deep as its name. Most crabs throughout history have lived in the ocean, and the handful that eventually moved into rivers, swamps, and dry land left behind a frustratingly incomplete fossil trail, mostly broken claws and scattered shell fragments. This one small complete specimen pushed the confirmed timeline for that ocean to freshwater migration back by tens of millions of years earlier than anyone had solid proof for previously evidence that crabs were already testing out life away from the sea, while dinosaurs feathered and otherwise still walked the very same ground. Researchers studying crab evolution more broadly now believe this particular migration ocean toward freshwater and eventually dry land actually happened independently, at least a dozen separate times across the entire crab family tree, different lineages on different continents, all arriving at roughly the same bold decision to abandon the sea entirely on their own, without any coordination between them whatsoever. This one tiny specimen gills still intact caught the process, caught partway through evidence of a body still tied to water, even as its descendants were already edging toward land. Mushrooms, believe it or not, survived here too, which might be the single most improbable entry on tonight's entire list. Fungi almost never fossilize under ordinary conditions. Mushrooms are soft watery and built to decay within days of appearing, which is precisely their job in any healthy forest, breaking down fallen wood and returning it to the soil before quietly vanishing themselves, often within a week of first pushing up through leaf litter. Yet inside, Burmese amber researchers identified a genuine complete fruiting body cap, and all a species now called Paleoagaricites antiquus, among the very oldest gilled mushrooms ever found anywhere in the fossil record. For a single mushroom cap to survive 99 million years intact, resin had to catch it at almost precisely the right moment, not too early before it had properly formed, and not too late after decay had already begun its usual quiet work. Somewhere in that same ancient forest, an entire generation of mushrooms sprouted, released their spores, and rotted away within days, leaving nothing behind at all. This one alone happened to stand in exactly the wrong place, or perhaps the right place, at exactly the right moment for a falling drop of resin. It is a small, humble little miracle honestly sitting there in a museum drawer, having somehow outlasted nearly every dinosaur that ever lived around it purely by accident of timing. And finally the flowers, because this particular forest was not simply crawling with animals, it was blooming, from that very same Hukang Valley. Deposit researchers have described a delicate, perfectly preserved flower, named Lyginganthus revoluta, complete with petals, sepals and reproductive structures still clearly visible after all this time. It belongs to a group botanists called core eudicots, a major branch of flowering plants that eventually gave the world roses, sunflowers, and the overwhelming majority of flowering species blooming in your own garden today. Flowering plants themselves were still a fairly recent invention on the evolutionary timescale of this particular forest, having only really begun spreading and diversifying a few tens of millions of years earlier. Before that, the world had been dominated for a much longer stretch by ferns, conifers and cycads plants that release pollen into open air or water rather than packaging it inside a colourful insect-attracting bloom. Finding a flower, this developed this recognisably modern in structure, dating back to the very same 99-million-year-old moment as our feathered dinosaur tale tells us something worth sitting with for a moment. Flowering plants were not some later arrival showing up quietly after the dinosaurs had already had their turn on the stage the way a museum diorama might sometimes suggest. They were blooming right alongside them, sharing the very same patch of forest floor, the very same rain, the very same fading afternoon light quietly transforming the planet's ecosystems while dinosaurs were still very much in charge of them. Put it all together and something rather remarkable comes into focus. One relatively small forest in one relatively small corner of what is now northern Myanmar has managed to hand modern science a snake, a frog, a crab, a mushroom and a flower alongside everything else we have already covered tonight, all from the very same narrow slice of time. Not scattered fragments pulled from a dozen different sites across the globe, stitched together by educated guesswork, but one single coherent ecosystem caught whole, the way you might catch an entire orchestra, mid-performance, rather than piecing together the music from a handful of surviving sheet music pages. A geologist could study a snake fossil from one continent, a flower fossil from another, and a mushroom from a third, and spend an entire career simply guessing at how those three unrelated organisms might have once shared a single afternoon together. Here that guesswork simply is not necessary. They shared the same rain, the same canopy, quite possibly the same square metre of forest floor. I find myself wondering honestly what a single afternoon walk through that forest would have actually sounded like, felt like, smelled like, if any of us could somehow stand there for just a few minutes. Frogs calling somewhere near standing water, a snake sliding quietly through damp leaf litter, mushrooms pushing up through the moisture after a recent rain, flowers just beginning to open toward whatever light made it through that thick, ancient canopy. None of these small creatures paying the slightest attention to one another, each one simply going about its own narrow, urgent business on what was for every single one of them just another ordinary Tuesday. What do you imagine it would have felt like standing in the middle of all that 99 million years before any of us existed to ask the question? I would love to know your own picture of it down in the comments before we move on together, because there is one more resident of that same ancient forest we've not properly discussed yet, and its story turned into one of the strangest, most humbling lessons modern paleontology has taught itself in recent memory. A lesson about how easily even careful, well-trained scientists can occasionally see exactly what they are hoping to see, rather than what the evidence actually shows them. It involves a skull barely larger than your smallest fingernail, a claim that made headlines around the entire world, and a correction that arrived only months later, quieter than the original announcement, but considerably more important. That is exactly where we are headed next. Every scientist likes to imagine they would recognize their own mistake instantly the moment it happened, clear as daylight. Real science, the honest version of it anyway, rarely works quite that cleanly. Sometimes a mistake sits there in plain sight for months, agreed upon by an entire team of truly brilliant people, reviewed by other experts before publication, printed on the cover of one of the most prestigious journals on the planet, before anyone involved manages to see it for what it actually is. This next story is exactly that kind of mistake, and I happen to think it is one of the more useful stories in this entire evening, precisely because nobody involved comes across as careless or foolish. They come across as human, which, if you ask me, makes the whole thing considerably more interesting than a simple tale of scientific triumph ever could. We've spent this evening marvelling at how much certainty amber can occasionally offer actual blood chemistry, actual colour, actual behaviour caught mid-motion. This particular story is a useful reminder that certainty, even the kind built on careful, respected, peer-reviewed science, still deserves a healthy amount of humility standing right beside it. In March of 2021, of the most respected scientific journals in the entire world, Nature published a paper describing a skull pulled from Burmese amber, barely 14 millimeters from end to end, smaller than your smallest fingernail. Inside that tiny fragment of skull sat an enormous pair of eye sockets, disproportionately large for the rest of the face, a long, slender, tapering snout and rows of small, delicate teeth, lining the jaw closer in number and arrangement to a lizard's mouth than anything you would expect on a bird. Researchers compared its overall size to the smallest hummingbird alive today, the tiny bee hummingbird found only in Cuba, and concluded after careful analysis that they were looking at the smallest dinosaur ever discovered, an early relative of modern birds, so small it could have comfortably perched on the tip of your finger feathers, and all had any feathers happen to survive alongside it. The announcement made the cover of Nature, an honour most scientists spend entire careers hoping to achieve even once. Newspapers around the world picked up the story within hours, running headlines about the tiniest dinosaur skull ever found, smaller than the smallest living hummingbird trapped inside a drop of prehistoric tree resin. Television segments followed. Museums began fielding calls from visitors asking when they might get to see it in person. For a few remarkable weeks, this tiny, big-eyed creature, formerly named Oculodenta viscountgrae, became one of the most talked-about fossils on the entire planet, a genuine, delightful sensation, the kind of story that makes people who otherwise never think about paleontology suddenly excited about a bird-sized dinosaur from 99 million years ago, sharing the image with friends, marvelling at how something this small could possibly have survived intact for so long. Here is where the story takes its first quiet turn though, and it happened remarkably fast. Almost immediately, other paleontologists reading the same published data the original team had relied on started raising a rather specific, rather technical concern. Tucked inside that tiny eye socket sat a delicate ring of small overlapping bones called a scleral ring, a structure many reptiles and birds share wrapped directly around the eyeball itself, helping the eye hold its shape and focus properly, particularly useful for creatures that need to judge distance quickly, whether they are hunting something small or avoiding becoming a meal themselves. Birds and lizards both have this structure, but the individual bony plates that make it up are shaped subtly differently between the two groups, differently enough that a trained eye can usually tell them apart at a glance. The particular shape of the ring inside this specimen several independent researchers pointed out once they looked closely matched a lizard's eye far more convincingly than any bird's living or extinct. It was a small detail tucked deep inside a much larger, more exciting announcement, easy enough to overlook if you were not specifically looking for it, or if you had already quietly decided in advance what you expected the answer to be. Then, within a matter of months, a second specimen surfaced considerably more complete than the first, preserving not just a skull this time, but a partial body as well, including scales unmistakably reptilian in structure and texture, arranged in a pattern no bird has ever grown in the entire history of feathered flight. This second piece had not come from the original research team at all. It emerged instead from a private collection, examined independently by a separate group of scientists who quickly recognized what they were looking at did not match the celebrated conclusion everyone else had already settled on. There was no ambiguity left to argue about once that second specimen arrived. No eye structure to debate, no room left for competing interpretations. Whatever this strange big-eyed little creature actually was, it was not a dinosaur. It was not remotely related to birds at all. It was against every headline printed only months earlier a lizard, and a fairly bizarre one at that one that had simply happened to evolve an eye and a face shape that briefly convincingly fooled some of the most careful scientists working in the field today. On the 22nd of July that same year, the original authors did something scientists find remarkably difficult to do in public, no matter how confident or well-trained they happen to be. They retracted their own paper, voluntarily, formally requesting that Nature withdraw the very study that had briefly made their careers famous, stating plainly that they wanted to prevent inaccurate information from lingering any further inside the scientific record. Retractions like that remain fairly rare across the entire history of scientific publishing. Most retractions that do happen tend to involve outright misconduct, fabricated data plagiarism results nobody else can reproduce no matter how carefully they try. A voluntary retraction over an honest, understandable misinterpretation requested by the very scientists who made it, ranks considerably rarer still. It is in its own strange way one of the more admirable things I've come across while researching tonight's story honestly, a group of respected scientists choosing a moment of public embarrassment, printed in the same prestigious journal that had just celebrated them over the quieter, easier option of simply letting a flawed paper sit there uncorrected, indefinitely hoping nobody outside the field would ever bother checking closely enough to notice. One member of that original research team, paleontologist Jingmai O'Connor, later offered a rather candid explanation for how the mistake happened in the first place, and I think it might be the single most useful sentence in this entire story. She admitted that certain features of that original skull, including that same eye structure now recognized as distinctly lizard-like, had actually been noticed by the team from the very beginning. They had simply interpreted those features through the lens of what they were already expecting to find. Having approached the fossil, already leaning toward a bird-shaped conclusion, Informed by other authentically bird-like features elsewhere in the skull, the entire team quietly filtered every ambiguous piece of evidence through that same expectation, seeing confirmation where a more neutral set of eyes might have seen a warning sign instead. She later described it almost like wearing a particular pair of glasses without realizing it, one that quietly adjusted everything she looked at to fit a shape she'd already half decided upon. Does that particular pattern sound at all familiar to you from anywhere in your own life? Because I suspect it might if you sit with it for a moment. Confirmation bias. The tendency to notice and remember details that support what we already believe, while quietly overlooking the ones that do not, is not really a scientist's flaw specifically. It is a distinctly human one showing up everywhere, from careful laboratory research all the way down to an argument you had with someone this past week, both of you walking away afterward, feeling completely certain the evidence had clearly been on your own particular side the entire time. It shows up when you meet someone new and decide within the first 2 minutes whether you like them, then spend the rest of the evening quietly collecting evidence to support that first impression, barely noticing the moments that might have complicated it. It shows up when you're convinced a particular road is always more crowded than the alternative, and somehow only ever seem to remember the days that proved you right. A team of world-class paleontologists fell into exactly that same very ordinary trap, simply wearing considerably more expensive equipment while they did it. The story did eventually reach a settled, considerably less dramatic conclusion. That second, more complete specimen was formally described roughly a year later as a new species within the very same genus named Oculodentavis naga, honouring the Naga people, an indigenous community living near the amber mining region in Myanmar, where these fossils actually originate a naming choice, quietly acknowledging the human community connected to a discovery that had, until that point, mostly ignored them entirely. Researchers today generally agree this strange little creature was some kind of unusual lizard, though its exact position on the lizard family tree remains a properly open question. One paleontologists are still actively working through. Even now, some suggesting it may represent an entirely new branch, unlike anything else currently known. It went within the span of about a year from headline-making dinosaur to retracted embarrassment to quietly fascinating mystery in its own right, a demotion of sorts that somehow still left it more scientifically interesting than most creatures ever managed to be even once. Sometimes losing the flashy title turns out to be the more honest, more durable kind of legacy. The story has since then quietly become something of a teaching example, mentioned in university courses and scientific ethics discussions, well beyond paleontology itself, held up as a case study in exactly how a research community is supposed to behave when new evidence contradicts an earlier well-publicized conclusion. Not as a cautionary tale about incompetence, but as a working example of the entire system functioning properly, peer review catching what it could, outside scrutiny catching what peer review missed, and the original authors themselves ultimately choosing transparency over quiet avoidance. It is in its own understated way a considerably more instructive story than a simple uninterrupted success would ever have managed to be. I want to push back gently, if you will let me, against how this particular story tends to get framed whenever it comes up. It is very easy to hear a phrase like scientific retraction and assume it represents some kind of failure, a team of experts caught being sloppy or worse, dishonest, the sort of headline that quietly undermines public trust in science more broadly every time it happens. I would offer you a rather different way of looking at it. A field that quietly buries its own mistakes, hoping nobody outside ever notices them, is a field you should probably worry about. A field willing to stand up in front of the entire world, admit an error within months of making it, and calmly correct the public record without excessive defensiveness is a field actually doing exactly what it claims to do. Being wrong occasionally is not really the opposite of good science. Refusing to admit it would be. If anything, the speed of this particular correction, months rather than years or decades, should probably count as a point in favor of how the system is supposed to function, rather than evidence against it. Have you ever had to publicly walk back something you were once fairly certain about, whether at work, in a friendship, or simply in an argument with someone you love? It is never a comfortable thing to do, regardless of the size of the audience watching you do it. I would honestly be curious whether that kind of experience left you feeling worse about being wrong in the first place, or oddly better afterward, having corrected it out loud instead of quietly, privately hoping nobody would ever notice or bring it up again. There is a particular kind of relief, I think, in simply saying the thing plainly, rather than carrying it around unspoken. There is one more detail worth sitting with before we move any further tonight, though, and it reaches beyond this one small lizard entirely. Both specimens of Oculudentavis, the original headline-making skull, and the second more complete body that eventually corrected the record, share the exact same origin as nearly everything else we have discussed this evening. Not carefully excavated by a research team working an official permitted dig site the way you might picture a fossil discovery unfolding in a documentary. Purchased. Acquired from private amber dealers and museum collections built almost entirely around material bought on the open market, often changing hands more than once before any scientist ever laid eyes on it. That detail rarely makes it into the headlines about tiny dinosaurs or tiny lizards or feathered tails. It sits quietly underneath nearly every single discovery this particular region of the world has ever handed to science, this one included, in a region of Myanmar where the legal and ethical questions surrounding that market run considerably deeper than a simple retraction can ever fully resolve questions involving conflict displacement and money changing hands in ways far more consequential than an honest mistake about the shape of a fossilized eye. We have touched on it once already tonight briefly, and set it aside to keep moving. It deserves considerably more than a passing mention now. That is exactly where we are headed next. There is a word for Burmese amber that occasionally shows up in trading circles, mostly in Chinese, and once you learn what it actually means, it becomes difficult to unhear it, or to look at any of tonight's earlier stories quite the same way again. Blood amber. The name partly describes something simple and physical. The deepest, most prized pieces of this particular amber carry a rich, almost crimson undertone when held up to the right light, a genuine natural colour, nothing dyed or artificially enhanced about it, prized by collectors precisely because it looks less like fossilized tree sap and more like something warmer, more alive. But the name carries a second, considerably heavier meaning too, a deliberate echo of another phrase you've probably heard before in an entirely different context. Blood diamonds, gemstones whose extraction has helped fund armed conflict elsewhere in the world. That comparison did not appear by accident, and it was not invented by outside critics looking to score a rhetorical point. It emerged largely from within the trade itself, an uncomfortable bit of honesty tucked inside an otherwise ordinary industry term. People who use the phrase blood amber are making a specific uncomfortable claim that the same beautiful golden stone responsible for nearly everything we have marvelled at tonight, a dinosaur's tail, a hunting hell, and a tiny lizard, mistaken for the smallest dinosaur ever found, also happens to be tangled up in a real ongoing human conflict, one considerably more serious than any scientific disagreement we have covered so far this evening. Let me walk you through this honestly, because I think you deserve the complicated version rather than a comfortable simplified one. Nearly all Burmese amber comes from a single region, Kachin State, in the far northern reaches of Myanmar near the Chinese border. The same general area we've returned to again and again tonight. Kachin State is also home to one of the longest-running armed conflicts anywhere in the world, a struggle between the Myanmar military known as the Tatmadaw and an ethnic armed organisation called the Kachin Independence Army, fighting for greater autonomy for the Kachin people, a distinct ethnic group with their own language, culture and long history in this mountainous corner of the country. That conflict stretches back to the 1960s, only around 2 decades after Myanmar first gained independence from British rule, which means this war predates the modern amber trade boom by a considerable stretch. Decades of fighting, periods of uneasy ceasefire, and renewed violence largely unfolding far from international headlines. Amber did not start this particular conflict, but over time as international demand for Burmese amber grew sharply, particularly from collectors and jewellery buyers in China, over roughly the past 15 years, amber became something else entirely, a resource both sides of that conflict could tax, control and profit from. Not unlike how control over jade mines and other valuable resources in the same general region has funded fighting for decades already well before a single scientist ever took an interest in what might be hiding inside those particular stones. Control over the actual mining areas has changed hands more than once in recent years too, adding another layer of instability on top of an already fragile situation. Renewed fighting in the region around 2017 saw Myanmar's military push to take direct control of significant mining territory previously administered by the Kachin Independence Army, a shift that international human rights investigators later examined, closely documenting serious concerns about how civilians in the area were treated throughout that same period. Reports from human rights organizations describe displacement connected to fighting over these exact mining areas, families losing access to land they had lived on for generations, miners working under seriously dangerous, poorly regulated conditions to extract a material that would eventually travel through several hands, cross an international border, and end up quite possibly on a laboratory table thousands of miles away, examined under a microscope by a paleontologist with absolutely no idea what that particular piece of stone had cost the people who originally pulled it out of the ground. Mining itself, quite apart from the surrounding conflict, carries its own ordinary dangers: narrow hand-dug shafts, unstable ground workers descending daily into conditions few outside observers would consider remotely safe, all in pursuit of a material whose true value most of those same workers will likely never fully see reflected back to them. Which brings us to the argument that split the paleontology community rather sharply in the year 2020, the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. One of the field's largest and most respected professional organizations issued a formal statement, that year calling for a pause, essentially a moratorium on the scientific study and publication of new research involving Burmese amber, urging scientists and academic journals alike to hold off until the ethical and legal questions surrounding its extraction could be properly addressed. Several major scientific journals responded fairly quickly, adopting policies restricting or heavily scrutinizing submissions built around newly acquired Myanmar amber specimens. Their reasoning followed a fairly straightforward economic logic. Scientific interest drives commercial value. A piece of amber containing a scientifically significant fossil, a feathered tail, a tiny lizard skull, is worth vastly more on the open market than an ordinary fossil-free piece destined for jewellery, sometimes many, many times more. If scientists keep eagerly publishing dramatic new discoveries, the argument goes, they keep raising the market price for exactly the kind of amber miners and dealers have every incentive to keep pulling out of a conflict zone, whether or not any individual scientist ever intends to fund violence directly. Stop publishing, stop feeding that demand, and you remove at least one piece of the financial incentive keeping that particular market so active in the first place. It is not a foolish argument. I want to say that plainly before I tell you the other side of it, because both sides of this particular debate are being made by thoughtful, well-intentioned people, not villains and heroes conveniently sorted into opposing camps for the sake of a tidier story. More than 50 scientists signed a public letter pushing back against that same call for a boycott, and their reasoning deserves just as much honest consideration. A boycott, they argued, would fall hardest on early career researchers, graduate students and young scientists in China and elsewhere who had built entire projects, sometimes entire careers around amber material that had already been purchased, often years earlier, long before this particular debate ever became public, through absolutely no fault of their own. Refusing to study specimens already sitting in museum drawers does not somehow return that money to anyone in Kachin state, does not undo any harm already done, and does not free a single miner from dangerous working conditions. It simply means that whatever scientific knowledge that specimen might have offered stays locked away, permanently unexamined, benefiting absolutely no one at all. Neither the people who mined it nor the wider world hoping to learn something true from it. Several of the signatories also pointed out that other prominent fossil sites around the world carry their own complicated, sometimes troubling histories tied to colonialism, to unequal power between wealthy institutions and the communities their specimens actually came from, and questioned why Myanmar amber specifically had become the flashpoint for this particular reckoning, rather than the opening move in a broader, more consistent conversation about the entire field. There is a third layer to this conversation too, one that gets discussed less often, but that I personally find just as important as the money itself. Researchers have started calling it parachute research, a term borrowed from other scientific fields facing similar criticism, describing the pattern of outside scientists arriving, gathering material or data from a country, and departing again, leaving little of lasting value behind for the local community that made the discovery possible in the first place. Even scientists who study amber already sitting safely in museum collections, causing no new demand whatsoever, have sometimes been criticized for treating Myanmar largely as a source of raw material, rather than as a place with its own scientists, its own universities, its own communities, who might reasonably expect real involvement, genuine credit and lasting benefit from research built entirely on specimens originally pulled out of their own ground. A specimen can be purchased years before any controversy existed, studied with complete scientific rigor, published in a respected journal with every proper citation in place, and still raise a fair question worth asking honestly. Who actually benefits from this discovery beyond the institution publishing the paper, and beyond the small circle of specialists who ever study it closely? I do not think I can hand you a tidy, satisfying answer here tonight, and I want to be honest about that rather than pretend otherwise. Part of me understands the boycott completely, the discomfort of knowing that genuine excitement over a beautiful scientific discovery sits directly downstream from real human suffering. Most of us will never see or fully understand, tucked quietly behind every headline about a dinosaur's tail or a hunting hell ant. Part of me also understands the researchers who pushed back, watching years of careful, honest work suddenly treated as morally suspect through no fault of their own, while the actual conflict continues entirely unaffected by whether one particular paper gets published or quietly shelved somewhere instead. I suspect the most honest answer available to any of us is that both of those feelings can be true at exactly the same time, sitting uncomfortably beside each other refusing to cancel each other out no matter how badly we might want a cleaner resolution. It reminds me in a strange way of other everyday choices most of us quietly make, without thinking too hard about them, buying a phone built partly from minerals, mined under conditions we would never willingly witness ourselves, or clothing stitched together in factories we know very little about. Choosing most days not to look too closely, because looking too closely rarely changes anything about the situation itself, and mostly just changes how comfortable we feel while participating in it anyway. Amber research is not unique in facing this particular tension. It is simply one of the rare cases where the tension gets debated openly in public letters and formal society statements, rather than staying comfortably unexamined the way it usually does everywhere else. What would you have done if this decision had somehow landed on your own desk? Publish and risk being part of a market with real human costs attached to it? Or refuse and let genuine scientific knowledge sit locked away forever, helping absolutely no one while the conflict itself continues completely unchanged? Either way, I am honestly curious where you land on this down in the comments, and I mean that far more sincerely than I usually mean that particular request. This is not really a question with a clean correct answer waiting to be discovered. It might simply be one of those questions worth sitting with uncomfortably, rather than resolving too quickly, and moving on the way we so often do with difficult things once the initial discomfort starts to fade. Every single fossil we have discussed tonight, the dinosaur's tail, the hellant, the tiny snake, the small lizard, mistaken for something else entirely, carries this exact same weight quietly underneath it, whether any of us think about it or not while we marvel at what it reveals. The scientists who studied our own small feathered tail purchased it years before this particular debate became public, long before anyone was weighing these exact questions so openly. That does not erase the discomfort. It simply means the story we have spent this evening following sits, whether we like it or not, on precisely the same complicated ground as everything else we've discussed tonight. Wonder and cost sitting inside the very same golden stone, refusing to be separated from one another, no matter how badly we might sometimes wish they could be. I do not say any of this to spoil the wonder you have hopefully felt at several points tonight, by the way. I say it because I think genuine wonder can survive a little honesty standing right beside it, and because pretending a story this remarkable arrived free of any cost at all would be its own quiet kind of dishonesty, one I would rather not hand you even in service of a tidier evening. Let's step back now further than we have stepped back all evening, away from markets and mines and moral debates entirely, and out into something almost too large to properly hold in your mind, at once the sheer staggering scale of time this one small stone has actually survived. Because after everything we have covered tonight, the chemistry, the market, the science, the arguments about who benefits and who does not, there is still one number sitting underneath all of it that deserves its own quiet moment of attention before this evening goes any further. 99 million years is not simply a large number. It is nearly unusable as a number at all, the kind of figure the human mind was never really built to hold on to properly, and I think it deserves considerably more respect than we have given it so far tonight, buried as it has been under bones and chemistry and controversy. That is exactly where we're headed next. Let me clear up something first, a small mix-up so common that I suspect most of us have been carrying it around for years without ever noticing. If someone asked you to picture the age of dinosaurs, there is a fairly strong chance one particular word floats up automatically in your mind before any other: Jurassic. It has become something near a catch-all term in ordinary conversation, a single label casually covering every dinosaur that has ever appeared in a movie or museum exhibit, or a toy aisle regardless of when any of them actually lived. Here is the part that tends to surprise people once they hear it plainly laid out. The age of dinosaurs was not one single stretch of time at all. It was 3 separate, quite different chapters stacked one after another across an almost incomprehensible span of years, and the creature we have spent this entire evening with belongs to the very last of those 3, nowhere near the one everybody keeps naming by default. The story actually opens in the Triassic period, roughly 250 to 200 million years ago, when dinosaurs first appeared at all small unremarkable creatures, some barely larger than a house cat competing for space among a world still dominated by other stranger reptiles, entirely distant cousins of crocodiles that filled most of the roles dinosaurs would eventually take over. Then comes the Jurassic, the chapter that somehow claimed the whole franchise's name for itself, stretching from around 200 million years ago to about 145 million years ago, home to truly enormous long-necked giants like Brachiosaurus, plated giants like Stegosaurus, and the earliest true flying reptiles gliding overhead on leathery wings. And finally the Cretaceous, the longest of the 3 chapters, by a wide margin nearly twice the length of the other 2 combined, running from roughly 145 million years ago, all the way down to 66 million years ago, home to Tyrannosaurus triceratops and considerably smaller and considerably less famous, our own particular feathered tail, trapped 99 million years ago comfortably in the middle of that final longest chapter, tens of millions of years after the Jurassic had already quietly shut its own doors and handed the story on to its successor. Which means, technically speaking, every single story we have told tonight has actually been a Cretaceous story, from beginning to end not a Jurassic one at all, despite what an entire industry of movies, toys and theme parks might have casually trained most of us to assume without ever really questioning it. Now that we have that particular correction out of the way, let's try something a little more ambitious together, because I think 99 million years truly deserves a proper attempt at being understood, rather than simply repeated as an impressive sounding number and quietly set aside. Here is a trick that helps me, and I'm hoping it might help you too. Picture the entire history of our planet, all 4.5 billion years of it, compressed down into a single calendar year, January the 1st to December the 31st, with Earth itself forming in the very first moment of January. Using that scale, the very first simple life would not appear until sometime in February. Nothing resembling a complex animal shows up until sometime in November. Plants only manage to colonize dry land sometime in early December. Dinosaurs themselves in this compressed calendar would not enter the picture until around the middle of December, a full 11 months into the year. Our own small feathered tail trapped in resin 99 million years ago would land on this same calendar somewhere around the 23rd or 24th of December, practically Christmas Eve in cosmic terms. And the asteroid that eventually ended the age of dinosaurs entirely would strike just a few days later, still right around December the 26th, barely enough time to properly clear away the wrapping paper. Humans, if you are curious, do not show up on this same calendar until the very final minutes of December the 31st, somewhere in the last half hour before midnight. Every war, every empire, every love story, every single thing any human being has ever built, loved, or lost fits inside roughly 30 seconds at the very end of an entire year, representing our planet's history. 99 million years on that same scale is not a rounding error. It is nearly a full week of that compressed calendar year an eternity. By comparison to the brief, frantic final half hour our entire species has occupied, and everything you personally have ever lived through fits somewhere inside the very last flicker of that final second. Have you ever tried holding a number like that in your mind for more than a few seconds at a time, I find it honestly slips away from me almost immediately, no matter how many different analogies I try stacking on top of one another. I do not think that failure says anything embarrassing about either of us, honestly. I think it says something true and rather humbling about the limits of an ordinary human mind trying to hold something built on a scale it was simply never designed to process. Let's talk properly now about what actually happened on that particular December the 26th, because we have circled around it more than once tonight without ever really sitting inside the details. Around 66 million years ago, an object roughly 10 to 15 kilometers across, somewhere between the size of a small city and a modest mountain, struck the Earth just off the coast of what is now Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, traveling at a speed of roughly 20 kilometers every single second, fast enough to cross the entire distance between New York City and Boston before you could finish blinking. The impact carved out a crater nearly 180 kilometers wide, deep enough to reach rock that had been buried for an enormous stretch of geological time, throwing an almost unimaginable quantity of vaporized stone dust and debris directly into the upper atmosphere within a matter of seconds. Near the impact site itself, the devastation was immediate and total. Forests flattened, seas thrown into towering waves racing outward across entire ocean basins. The sky itself briefly turned to fire as superheated debris rained back down across the surrounding region. What followed, though, was not simply a single violent afternoon, but a slow, planet-wide unravelling stretched across months and years. Sunlight dimmed dramatically across the entire globe, choked by ash and dust suspended high in the atmosphere, plunging much of the planet into a prolonged, bitter twilight. Plants that depended on that sunlight began dying en masse. Animals that depended on those plants followed soon after, and animals that depended on those animals followed right behind them, a collapsing chain reaction working its way steadily up through an entire interconnected world, one empty link in the food chain after another. When the dust and ash finally settled, somewhere near 75% of every species alive on the planet had vanished completely, including every single non-avian dinosaur left anywhere on Earth. I want to sit with that particular detail for just a moment because it connects directly back to where this whole evening actually began. Whatever became of the small feathered creature whose tail we spent our very first story with, whether it escaped that afternoon in the resin or did not, its wider lineage was living on borrowed time regardless, counting down toward an ending, scheduled roughly 33 million years further along. An ending it had absolutely no way of anticipating, the same way none of us ever really anticipate the precise shape of our own particular endings either. In a strange sort of way, being sealed inside that resin may have been the nearest thing to safety its entire species would ever manage to find. Everything else it knew, every relative, every rival, every creature sharing that same patch of forest floor, was eventually going to vanish either way. This one small fragment, purely by accident, ended up somewhere the asteroid could never quite reach. Not everything died, though, and that particular detail matters just as much as the devastation itself. Birds which we have spent considerable time tonight establishing really are dinosaurs, in the most technical, scientifically accurate sense of that word, survived their small bodies, varied diets, an ability to nest almost anywhere, apparently giving them just enough flexibility to slip through a catastrophe that erased every one of their larger, more specialized relatives. Small mammals survived too, mostly modest, unglamorous little creatures that had spent the entire age of dinosaurs living quietly in the margins, in burrows, in shadows, rarely growing terribly large, rarely drawing much attention to themselves at all, spending most of their existence quite literally in the shade of something bigger and more impressive. Crocodilians survived as well, largely unbothered, having already weathered enough of the planet's earlier catastrophes to develop what might be the single most successful body plan in the entire history of animal life. One so effective it has barely needed to change in tens of millions of years since. With the giants suddenly gone, and with so much of the world's available living space standing empty and unclaimed, those same small, unremarkable survivors began spreading, diversifying and growing considerably bolder across an emptied planet, filling niches that had been firmly occupied only weeks earlier in geological terms. Within a relatively short span of geological time, by the standards of everything else we've discussed tonight, mammals had produced early primates, small curious forest-dwelling creatures with grasping hands and forward-facing eyes built for judging distance among tree branches. Considerably later, still one particular branch of those primates learned to walk upright, then to speak, then to write things down so that stories like this one could eventually be told at all. That branch produced us. There is something worth sitting with honestly in that particular sequence of events, and I do not think it needs much decoration from me to land properly. Dinosaurs taken as an entire group ruled this planet for more than 150 million years, an almost unfathomable reign by any reasonable measure, considerably longer than mammals have had the run of the place since, and vastly, almost embarrassingly longer than our own species has been around to witness any of it. And it still ended completely within what amounts to a single afternoon measured against the true scale of geological time. Nothing. It turns out, no matter how dominant, no matter how perfectly adapted to its own particular moment, gets any kind of permanent exemption from that same basic rule. Continents shift. Climates swing wildly in directions nobody living through them could have predicted. Rocks fall out of a clear sky roughly once every 100 million years or so on average, and everything alive at that exact moment simply has to bear whatever consequences follow, whether or not it saw any of it coming. Does that thought unsettle you at all, sitting here at the end of a long day listening to a story about a stone from a vanished forest? It unsettles me a little too honestly, if I am being completely truthful with you. There is something almost dizzying about realizing that the most successful, most dominant creatures this planet has ever produced simply ran out of time through no failing of their own, no flaw in their design, nothing they could have reasonably prepared for or defended against. But there is a quieter, gentler thought hiding right alongside that unsettling one, if you are willing to sit with both of them together for a moment, rather than rushing toward whichever one feels more comfortable. Everything ends eventually, yes. And yet against every reasonable statistical odd, some small fragile fragments of what came before managed to survive anyway, tucked safely away, in exactly the right conditions, waiting patiently for someone someday to notice them again. A tail, a feather, a single perfectly preserved colour, chestnut brown against pale white carried intact across an asteroid strike, an ice age, the rise and fall of entire mountain ranges, and the complete rewriting of life on this entire planet not once but several times over. Endings, it turns out, are rarely quite as total as they first appear from a distance. Something small nearly always seems to slip through if you are patient enough and lucky enough to go looking for it. Which brings us at last back to where we actually started this evening, that same small golden stone, resting quietly in someone's open palm, having somehow outlasted absolutely everything else that existed alongside it. If you had to guess before tonight how much of the deep past could possibly survive intact into the present, would a number anywhere near 99 million years have even occurred to you as a realistic answer? I would love to know honestly whether tonight's story has changed that number at all for you, even slightly, down in the comments whenever you get a moment, We have one more stop left to make together this evening, a quieter one than most of what has come before it, and I think it might be the most fitting place of all to finally bring this particular story to rest. That is exactly where we are headed next, somewhere tonight inside a quiet research collection at the Dexu Institute of Paleontology, sitting in a drawer among hundreds of other pieces of amber, none of them nearly as famous. Our small stone is simply resting. No microscope trained on it at this exact moment. No researcher standing over it with careful notes and steady hands. Just a piece of fossilized tree sap roughly the size and shape of a dried apricot sitting quietly in the dark, the way it has sat quietly through almost every single moment of its own extraordinarily long existence. Picture this properly. Now one last time, eyes shut if you are somewhere safe enough for that. Warm gold catching whatever thin light happens to reach it. A small feathered shape curled inside chestnut brown, fading into pale white, exactly the way it looked on that first afternoon we spent together tonight, standing in a forest that no longer exists on a continent that has since drifted quietly into an entirely different shape. That same small scene, the one we opened this whole evening with, is still sitting there right now, sealed, patient, utterly unaware that anyone out here has ever thought about it at all. I keep coming back to that image, oddly enough, more than almost anything else we have covered this evening. Not the dinosaur alone, not the hell ant or the tiny lizard mistaken for something else entirely, or the argument that split an entire scientific community down the middle. Just a small stone sitting in a drawer doing absolutely nothing at all, the exact same way it did absolutely nothing at all for 99 million uninterrupted years before anyone ever thought to open that particular drawer and look inside. There is something almost unbearably gentle about that if you let yourself sit with it for a moment before we bring things to a proper end tonight. Think about everything that small object has actually witnessed in its own strange, passive, sealed-away kind of witnessing. It sat quietly through the exact afternoon, a small feathered creature brushed too near a tree. It sat quietly while resin slowly, patiently learned the long chemical trick of becoming stone. It sat quietly through a market stall in northern Myanmar through a scientist's hands, turning it over in the light through headlines printed on every continent, through arguments about who owns a discovery like this one and who bears its true cost. It sat quietly through an asteroid strike that rewrote every rule this planet has been operating under for the previous 150 million years. It sat quietly through the slow rise of the very mountains now casting a shadow across the valley it came from. It sat quietly while an entire human species evolved, invented language, built cities, fought wars, and eventually, almost as an afterthought at the very tail end of all that time, invented a way to send stories like this one across an ocean into a room where someone is now lying in the dark listening. And it did all of that witnessing while weighing, by most estimates, somewhere around a single ounce. Less than a letter you might drop in the mail. Less certainly than the weight of the actual feather still sitting preserved somewhere inside it. I think that might be the real title of tonight's whole story, if I'm honest with you. Not the dinosaur, not even the amber itself, technically speaking. The weight of a feather. Because that is really what we have been circling this entire evening, in one form or another, from the very first minute to this exact one. How something can be almost nothing at all, physically speaking, barely there, easily missed, easily crushed, and still somehow carry an entire world inside it, if it happens to land in exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment, and gets left alone by exactly the right combination of accidents for long enough afterward. A feather weighs almost nothing on its own. And yet this particular one has managed somehow to outweigh entire arguments, entire scientific careers, entire chapters of how we understand where birds actually came from. Weight, it turns out, was never really about mass in the first place. It was about what a thing manages to carry and how far it manages to carry it. None of what we covered tonight was inevitable when you really sit with it properly. It was not inevitable that a dying tree happened to be dripping resin at that precise moment. It was not inevitable that particular drop landed where it did, rather than a few careful inches to either side, missing the tail entirely, letting that small creature simply walk on into the rest of its life unremembered by anyone. It was not inevitable that this one small piece of amber avoided being ground down 99 million years later into a bead on someone's bracelet the way so much of the amber sitting right beside it in that same market almost certainly was its own small miracle, sliced apart and sold in pieces before anyone ever thought to look closely. It was not inevitable that a trained eye happened to be standing at exactly that table on exactly that afternoon, already primed by years of quiet practice to notice one detail that did not quite fit. It was not even inevitable that an international team scattered across 3 different countries would manage to coordinate carefully enough, patiently enough to actually finish the work and share what they had found with the rest of us. Every single piece of tonight's story depended on an almost absurd chain of unlikely accidents, stacked one on top of another, any single one of which could easily have gone differently, and probably did go differently an uncountable number of times, for every other piece of resin that ever fell in that same forest, and simply rotted away unnoticed, unremembered and gone completely. Which makes the fact that this one particular story survived to reach you tonight feel considerably less like fate, and considerably more like something closer to grace. A small, undeserved kindness handed down across an amount of time that truly refuses to fit comfortably inside an ordinary human mind, no matter how many calendars or comparisons we throw at it. And in its own quiet way, the fact that you happen to find this particular story tonight, out of everything else you could have possibly been doing with this exact hour, carries a small trace of that same accidental grace too. Nobody planned this exact moment, you lying somewhere quiet, this story arriving at precisely the right time to keep you company. It simply happened the way the best, most fitting things so often do. I think about that a fair amount, honestly, when I'm not working on stories like this one. About how much of what any of us will eventually leave behind depends on similarly small, similarly unpredictable accidents. Which conversations happen to get remembered and which quietly slip away. Which photographs survive a house fire and move a hard drive that finally gives out after years of faithful service. Which small kindness someone happened to witness at exactly the right moment and carried with them for the rest of their life, without you ever fully realizing how much it mattered to them. A recipe scribbled on a card and tucked into a drawer, still being cooked from decades after the person who wrote it is gone. A voicemail nobody quite has the heart to delete. None of us get to choose with any real precision what eventually survives of our own particular moment on this earth. We simply move through it as fully and as honestly as we can manage and let time decide, almost entirely on its own, what it eventually chooses to keep. That is not a sad thought, by the way, even though I realize it might land that way at first, especially this late in the evening. I actually find it rather comforting the more I turn it over. It means you do not have to control everything, or perfectly curate every single moment of your own life for some imagined future audience worrying endlessly about which parts of you will last and which will not. You simply have to inhabit it warmly and honestly, and trust that whatever is meant to be carried forward in whatever strange accidental form that ends up taking will find its own quiet way of doing so, the same way one small drop of resin out of countless others falling in that same forest on that same ordinary afternoon somehow managed to find its way all the way to you tonight, 99 million years and one very long story later. If you only carry one thing out of tonight's story and into whatever dream finds you next, let it be this rather than any single fact about vertebrae or melanosomes or scleral rings. Preservation was never really the point of any of this. Attention was. That tale survived because one small patient drop of resin happened to be paying attention to that exact spot on that exact afternoon. That discovery survived because one trained scientist happened to be paying closer attention than everyone else standing at that same market table. Every single piece of knowledge we now have about it survived because researchers on 3 different continents kept paying attention, carefully, patiently correcting themselves honestly whenever the evidence demanded it. Even the harder parts of tonight's story, the conflict, the cost, the uncomfortable questions about who actually benefits from a discovery like this one, only became visible to any of us because someone somewhere refused to stop paying attention once the story turned complicated. Wonder, it turns out, is not really a passive thing to feel. It is closer to a discipline, a habit of noticing practiced quietly and consistently enough that every so often, against wildly improbable odds, it manages to catch something the rest of the world would otherwise have let slip past entirely. So here is where we leave our small feathered friend and its long patient stone, sitting quietly in a drawer in a research collection on the other side of the world from wherever you happen to be lying right now, not doing anything at all, simply waiting the way it has always waited for whoever happens to open that drawer next, with absolutely no idea, no way of knowing that it had already done its most important work of all tonight, simply by reaching you. Thank you honestly for spending this particular evening with me and with this one small remarkable piece of the deep past. Storytelling like this only really works because someone on the other end is willing to slow down, dim the lights, and actually listen, and I do not take that for granted, not even a little. Whether you have been here since the very first story about a forest in ancient Myanmar, or you drifted in partway through somewhere around the hell ants, or the tiny lizard, mistaken for something else entirely, I am simply glad you were here at all. If tonight's journey gave you even a few minutes of genuine wonder, or helped your own mind finally quiet down enough to drift towards sleep, that alone makes every hour spent researching and writing this particular story worthwhile to me. If you have not already, I would love it if you considered subscribing so future stories like this one can find their way to you as easily as this one hopefully did tonight. A like helps more than you probably realize quietly, nudging this story toward other people who might need a little wonder in their evening too. People scrolling through their own quiet, restless nights, looking for exactly this kind of company. And if anything tonight stuck with you, a comment means more to me than I can properly put into words, a small tangible sign that this story actually landed somewhere real, in a real room, with a real person listening rather than simply drifting off into the general noise of the internet unnoticed. There are more stones like this one out there waiting patiently in drawers and collections all over the world, holding their own small accidental miracles ready for someone to finally open the right case and notice what they have actually been holding on to the entire time. Some of them older than tonight's story, some of them stranger, all of them, I suspect, carrying their own quiet version of this exact same lesson, that survival was never about size or strength in the first place, only about being caught gently at exactly the right moment. I would love nothing more than to bring you back here for the next one, and to sit with you again while we open whichever drawer we happen to find next. Until then, sleep well wherever you happen to be listening from tonight. Let the light stay low a little longer if you can. Let your own mind drift slowly the way that resin once drifted down a bark-covered trunk, unhurried, patient, in no rush at all, to reach wherever it happens to be going. And thank you truly for letting a small piece of 99 million-year-old amber and the little feathered life it once belonged to keep you company on this particular evening. I will be right here waiting quietly with the next one whenever you're ready to come back and find it.